In this video, I'm going to teach you how to build a multi-user to-do list using Python and Django. So the way it works is that multiple users can sign up on your to-do list and create to-do list or task items. So I would just like to demo how everything works to you. So right now we have the home page. But before you can actually visit the home page, you need to be authenticated. So only authenticated users can visit the home page. So I will just start by creating a new user and signing up. So let's put the user's name as first name as John, then the last name as Doe. So the username will be test user. Email is going to be that. Password is going to be. I'm just going to put the password. So this is like a demo of how everything looks like. Now, also this registration process also involves some validation. So if I enter two passwords that don't match, I want you to notice what we get. We have an error saying passwords do not match. So that means that we actually perform some verification. So you not only learn how to build the to-do list, you also learn how to build an authentication system plus a to-do list system inside one whole project. So you learn like a whole lot. So I'm going to put the first name as John, the last name as Doe. I'm going to put the username as test user. I'm going to put an email of, let's just put, instead of that, let's just put that test email. And for the password, I'm going to put the password there, and I'll put the password again, and I'm going to click register. Once I register, you can see I'm brought to the login page with a success message of account created login. So I'm just going to log in with just credentials. Now, once I log in, you will see that we are brought to this home page. Now, in the home page, you can see the full name, John Doe. We can see we can add a task, we can log out, we can also see the number of finished tasks and number of unfinished tasks, 0. Now, we actually are meant to have a bunch of tasks which are under this text, but because we haven't added any task, it is showing, obviously, it's showing no task. Now, if I actually head to the admin dashboard, I'm also going to show you how to interact with the Django admin dashboard. We can see that new user has been added, test user. We can see the username, email, first name, and last name. So I'm just going to add a new task. I'm going to add a task like take a walk in the evening. Now, once I add the task, you see there's a message that says new task saved successfully. And we can see that a new task has been added. Now, we can see that the finished task is still 0, but unfinished tasks has changed to 1. Then we can see that this task, take a walk in the evening, has 2 operations that I can perform. We can either delete that task or update it. Then when we update it, it is going to say, we're going to essentially set this task as completed, and it's going to have a strike through. But let me just add a few more tasks so you can see how it works. So I'm going to say wash dishes, and then the last one can be read a book. So now we have 3 tasks right here. You can see we have 3 unfinished tasks and we have 0 finished tasks. So in order to, let's just say, create 1 finished task, I'm just going to update take a walk in the evening as finished. So once I click update, you can see it says task completed successfully. We can see finished tasks is 1. And we can see there's a strike through that goes through this task, signaling that we've completed it. I can also update this wash dishes, and you can see that it has a strike through. Finished tasks is 2, unfinished is 1. So we're able to keep track of the number of tasks which were finished and the number that we haven't finished. And we can also delete a task. So I could delete this take a walk in the evening. And once I delete it, it says task deleted successfully. And you can see that it is gone. We can also delete this one, read a book. And you can see that unfinished tasks is 0, finished tasks is 1. So users are able to add any task they want. They are able to update a task as finished, and they are also able to make a task uncompleted. So for example, if I click update, it would set this task as not finished. So let's click update. Now you can see that task take a walk in evening has been, the strike through has been removed. So we can see 1 finished task, 1 uncompleted task, 1 unfinished task, and then we can then log out. So once we log out, we are redirected to this beautiful login page. And if we try accessing the home page, you see we are redirected back because only users who are logged in can access that home page. Now, I will also be teaching you how to deploy this project. That is, when you're done building this project, there's going to be a live link which you can share with your friends, your family, people. Basically, like it's going to be like a project that you can add to your portfolio. You can just copy the link and share it with people who you want to test it and interact with it. So the website is going to be live. So that is the intro for this video. Let's get into the tutorial. We are going to start off by setting up the Django project. Now, the first thing that we need to do is we need to navigate to where we want to store our project. So for me, I'm going to go to my YouTube folder, which is in my desktop. I'm going to go to desktop, I'll go to tutorial, and I'll go to YouTube. Now, once I am inside my desired location, I am going to create a new directory or a new folder. Now, this folder is going to be where we will store all our project files and resources. So, in order to make a new folder, I'm going to type the command mkdir, which is short for make directory, and I'm going to type in the folder name. So, this is going to be called Django-to-do-list. Now, I want you to create this folder called Django-to-do-list. Now, once you have created this folder, I want you to cd or change directory into this folder. I'm going to say cd Django-to-do-list. So let me just clear my screen now. Now, once I type ls or dir, you can see that the content of this directory is currently empty. Now, the first thing that we need to do inside our projects directory is create a virtual environment. Now, if you are not familiar with what a virtual environment is, a virtual environment is basically an isolated working environment on your computer system. Think of it like a container within a container. Now, the base container is obviously your computer system, while the virtual environment is the second container, which is living within your computer system. Now, I want to give you an example. Imagine right now, as a Python developer, you have installed, like Django 3.2 or something. You have installed an older Django version. Now, imagine you have projects which have been built using that Django version, but you want to work on a new project which requires a higher Django version. Now, updating the current version of Django, which is installed on your global system, which is 3.2, updating it might cause the project which you have built using it to crash or break due to incompatibility issues. Now, what we can do in this situation is create a virtual environment, and we can install all the dependencies that we want inside that virtual environment. So basically, that virtual environment acts like its own container, and it can store its own different version of dependencies right in there. So this is just like a brief explanation of what a virtual environment is. It's basically an isolated working environment that is totally independent of what you are doing on your normal global computer system. So on my global computer system right now, I can have Django 3.2 running, but inside the virtual environment I could have the latest version of Django running inside the environment, so it is independent of the global scope. So that is just what I wanted to explain about virtual environments. And when you are building a Django project, it is very, very important that it creates virtual environments so as to prevent incompatibility issues later on in the future. And virtual environments actually help you keep better track of how many libraries and how many modules you have used within your project. So it can help you track them better rather than creating a project locally rather than creating a project on a global scope and adding all the libraries that have been used in global scope. So that would be a bad practice. So what we need to do now is create a virtual environment. Now, if you have your own special way of creating virtual environments, by all means, I want you to go ahead. But for me, I like using a library called pipenv. Now, if you want to follow my way, the first thing that you need to do, first of all, is install this library if you don't have it installed. So I want you to run the command pip install pipenv. Now, once you run this command, it's going to install it for you on your global scope or on your computer system. Now, I already have it installed, so it's going to probably show me requirements already satisfied. Now that it says requirements already satisfied, the next thing that we need to do is then actually create a virtual environment. So if you want to create a virtual environment using the library we just installed, all you have to run is pip env space shell. Now, once you run this command, pipenv space shell, it will create a new virtual environment for you and activate it immediately. And the name of that virtual environment is going to be the name of your present working directory. and then there's going to be like a hyphen and a random character right beside it. So now if we take a look at the logs, we can see that it says successfully created virtual environment, and it says launching subshell in virtual environment. So basically now we know that our virtual environment has been created for us and it has been activated automatically. Now you might ask yourself, how do I exit this virtual environment? All you have to type is exit, and once you type that, you've automatically exited or deactivated the virtual environment. Now, to reactivate an already created virtual environment, all you have to do, first of all, is navigate your way to the folder or to the location where that virtual environment was created. And all you have to type again is pip env with shell. Now, once I run this, I want you to notice what it gives us. You know that, yeah, you see that it has given us it just says launching subshell in virtual environments, unlike the first time when it told us creating virtual environments. So what that basically tells us is that it's able to remember that it created the virtual environment inside this directory. And if I actually type ls, you can see that there is a file called pip file which has already been created for us. Now, after creating this virtual environment, the next thing we need to do is install Django, obviously, because we're trying to build this project using Django. We're going to run the command pip install Django. After installing Django, what we then need to do is create a Django project. So we do this by saying Django -admin space start project, project. And after this, we need to give it a project name. So I'm just going to call this to-do list. And once I press enter, this is going to create a new Django project called to-do list. And if I type dir or ls, we can see that aside the pip file, we now have a different directory called to-do list. So what we need to do is cd into this to-do list. So I'm going to say cd to-do list. Now, for complete beginners, you might ask yourself, so what exactly is this command and what is a project? So basically, a Django project is a, as the name says, it is a project that, contains everything that your Django application needs. So it contains, like your settings, it contains your configurations, it contains different applications, middlewares, and things of that nature. Now, something else that you need to take note of is applications. Now, Django has this kind of architecture where projects are divided into the project and application folders. Now, an application in a Django project is basically a modular piece of the project. So, an application is meant to perform a specific, is meant to perform specific functionalities. So, an application handles a specific piece of functionality within your site or your website. So, for example, imagine you are trying to build a website. Blogs can be assigned to one specific application in your Django project. So, one application can handle everything concerning blogs. Another application can handle everything concerning authentication, so enabling users log in, log out, reset password. Another application can handle things like payments, allowing users pay for, for things on your website using card or transfer or whatever. So that is basically what applications are in Django. They basically help to provide a specific piece of functionality, and they are modular in nature. So it means that using this architecture, it's actually very clean and it helps keep our project neat, knowing that one application performs a specific function. And like I said earlier, the project folder or the project itself contains settings which are very unique and which are very helpful for your specific project. So it contains settings and configurations for things like your database connections, your middlewares, adding installed apps, and different things like setting up your cache layer, setting up static files. So your project folder is very, very important, and we're going to see how all of them come together. Now, after creating this project folder and I type ls, you can see we have the project right here. What we need to do then is say cd to-do list. I'm going to type ls. Now, once I type ls, you can see that we now have some files which have been given to us. So you can see that we have a file called ascii.py, settings.py, urls.py, whiskey.py. So these are actually very important, and I just wanted to show you the content. As we go on in this project, you are going to understand how each of these files work. So I'm just going to say cd dots and type ls. Now we are back to our root directory. Your root directory is where you have your manage.py file. That is your base directory or root directory. Now, when we are proceeding, or in order to proceed, we need to create our first application. Now, this first application which we are going to create is going to help us handle things like, it's going to help us handle authentication. So we're going to be writing the backend logic as well as a little bit of front-end code, which is going to enable users to be able to register and log into our website. So all of these login and register features are going to be done in one specific app, and we're going to call this app authentication. In order to create a new Django application, you can run the command python manage.py. Now we are making reference to this manage.py file, which is in our base directory. So make sure you are in your base directory. So python space manage.py, then we're going to say start app. Now, what are we going to call this app? We're going to call it authentication. Now, once I press enter, a new folder that is called authentication is going to be created for us, and it is going to be an application folder. So once I type ls, you can see that we now have a new folder called authentication. So now we have two folders: authentication, which is our application folder, and to-do list, which is our projects folder. So what we now need to do next is we now actually need to open this folder inside our Visual Studio Code. Now, if you are on a Windows machine, you can just write code dot. Now, if you are using Visual Studio Code, it is just going to, this command code space dot is going to open that specific directory or that specific folder inside your code editor, which is VS Code. But if you are not using Visual Studio Code, if you are using um, any other code editor, what you can do is, open your code editor, probably head to files. Sorry, yes, I trust this. Probably head to files, and then you go to open folder. So when I click open folder, what you are then going to do is you are going to use your file explorer to search for where that project is, and then you open it. So after opening it in your code editor, I want you to, take a look at what we have now. We have our manage.py file. This is generated for us by default when we create a new Django project. Now, what we're going to do is, the next thing we need to do is we need to register our authentication app in our settings.py file. Now, remember that I said the projects folder basically helps us configure a lot of things which are useful to our site. So it helps with configurations with things like installed apps, databases, caches, and so on. In Django, anytime you create a new application folder or a new application, we need to head to the settings, scroll down to installed apps, and type in the name of the application. So in this case, it is authentication. Now, some of you might actually already know these things, but I'm just explaining in detail so that, if you are new to Django, this would be, very easy to follow. Now, what you will have here is installed apps. Now, each of these apps, which I had explained earlier, helps to perform a specific or provide specific functionality. Like I explained that in a project, we can have an app for blogs, we can have another app for authentication, we can have another app for payment. Now, each of these apps perform different operations. That is why they are called applications. They perform one specific operation. Now, that one specific operation might be divided into sub operations, but the main idea is that they perform one specific operation. And what we have here are apps which have been generated by default by Django, which perform specific operations. For example, the Django.contrib.admin, this gives us the default Django admin website, or the default Django admin dashboard, and we're going to see how this will work. Then we have the Django.contrib.auth.sessions. This helps us to manage sessions. We have Django.contrib.messages. This helps us display or flash messages in the front end. We're actually going to be making use of this, but not now. I'm going to show you how we are going to make use of it. Then we have static files. I'm going to show you how to set up static files and what exactly static files are. And then we have authentication, which is the folder that we had just created. Now, after doing that, the next thing that we need to do is create a file called urls.py. So I want you to go to your authentication folder, and I want you to create a new file. So right click on it and create a new file. So I'm just going to click new file and call it urls.py. Now, what this file basically is going to help us do is it's going to help us map views URLs. Now, URLs are basically endpoints which we can visit in the website or which we can visit in our web browser that take us to a specific website. So, for example, when I go to my browser and I type instagram.com forward slash about, for example. This instagram.com forward slash about is an endpoint. It's a URL endpoint which takes you to a specific page. So this is exactly where we're going to be configuring all our URLs. Now, our URLs determine what the user sees. So that is why we map URLs to views. And that is why it is called views, because our view determines what the user views or what kind of data the user receives. Now that view is going to be mapped to a URL. So the URL determines what the user can see or what the user will see based on what URL they visit. So that URL is going to be mapped to a view. So don't forget it. The URL determines what the user see because it is mapped to a view, and different views are going to return different types of data. So we're going to see how this will work. The first thing that we need to do is import this views file. Now, I'm sure you have experience with Python if you are learning Django right now. So this shouldn't be difficult to understand. So I'm going to say from dot import views. So what I'm basically doing is saying from dot, it means from this current working directory, that is because URL is inside authentication. I'm saying, okay, from this current folder or from this current directory, which is called authentication, import the views.py file. So that is why I can say from dot import views. Now, the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to import a built-in method that Python actually gives us. I'm going to say from Django.urls, sorry, that Django gives us, I mean. So we're going to say from Django.urls or URLs, import path. Now, this is basically a method that Django gives us, which helps us declare or create URL endpoints. So the next thing we then need to do is create a list, which is going to house all our URL endpoints in this specific application. So I'm going to call it URL patterns. Now make sure this is the list. If not, make sure this is the name of the variable. If not, you'll get an error. So you make it equals an empty list for now and save it. Now, once you saved it, the next thing we need to do is head to our to-do list project folder. Now, once you are in the folder, I want you to open the urls.py file inside your project folder, which is called to-do list. Now, there's something that we need to do anytime we are trying to create, a new URLs file in an application. It's a two-way process, actually. The first thing you need to do is, obviously import your views.py file or import your views from your views.py file. Then the next thing you need to do is import also path from Django.urls and create your URL patterns list. Now, after setting up the URL in the app folder, you need to register that URL in your projects folder. So this is why I said the projects folder is very, very important. It helps to configure a lot of things. So by registering this URL in the app folder, by registering this URL, which is present in the app folder, in the projects folder, what we're trying to tell Django is that, okay, we have a URL file which is present in our authentication application. So I want you to take note of the URL file because users could potentially visit endpoints on that URL. So how do we do this? Where we see from Django.urls import path, we also want to import another method called include. Now, what include basically helps us do is that it helps us go into an application folder. It will look at the URLs file and tell Django, okay, hey, this is a URL file which contains several endpoints which map to this application. So I want you to take note of this URL file so that users will be able to visit this endpoint. Now, if you don't do this, you are going to get an error because Django wouldn't know that you have a URL file present here. So what we need to do is type path. Now, after you type path, the first thing that you need to type in is the URL path, which is going to be mapped to this specific URL. Now, I am going to explain exactly what this means, but for now, just type quotes and leave it empty. Now, the next thing we need to type is include. Now, after typing in include, which we had imported, in here, we now need to type in the name of the application in quotes. So because the name of the application is called authentication, I will just type that in. Authentication, and what I will pass in next is .urls. So what we're basically trying to say is we're trying to include the URLs file, right, which is inside the authentication project. So Django is going to go to look for an application whose name is authentication, and then it is going to look for a file whose name is urls. And once it opens it, it's going to see this. So once you do that, I want you to just save it. Now, remember that I said we are going to be leaving this empty and I will explain it. So this is the point where I am going to explain it. But the first thing that we need to do is head to our authentication file. And here we're just going to create a very simple view. So if you already have this knowledge, or if you already understand how this works, please bear with me. I am trying to explain this properly for people who are, like total beginners. So what we need to do first of all is create a view called def, like home, for example. And this is going to take in request. Now, what we're just going to do is return a string. And I'm going to say return hello world, right? Now we've created a view right here. We need to map this view to a specific URL. So I'm just going to go to my authentication app, right? Because this view is in my authentication folder, I am going to map this view to the URL inside the authentication folder also. Now I'm just going to type in path. Now in here, I'm going to type in home. Now put a forward slash right there. And here I'm going to type views dot home. I am going to save it. So what we have done here now is we have created a very simple view called home, right? And we created a URL, which is the endpoint home. And we've mapped it to that view by calling views.home. So when you are creating a URL or a path, you type in the path which you want to map to that specific view, then you type in the actual view name. So once I save that, I want you to head to your browser. And what we're just going to do is, head to your terminal. The next thing we're going to do is run our Python server. So run python manage.py, run server. So this is just going to start our local development server for us, and it's going to run it so we can actually access our Django project. Don't worry about these errors for now. What I just want you to do is copy this link and visit it in your browser. So I'm just going to open it right now because I clicked it. Now, once I click it, notice that we are having this error, page not found. But once I go to /home, I want you to notice what we see. Now, when I go to /home, we're having this error. That is because I actually need to return a HTTP response. So go back to your views.py file and type this from Django.http import HTTP response. So what I'm just going to do now is I'm just going to return a HTTP response that is going to house this hello world text. I'm just trying to explain how, I'm just going trying to explain how the URLs work. So make sure your server is running and refresh. Now, once I refresh, you can see that we have hello world getting printed out. Because we visited /home, it means that when we visited /home, Django came to this URL, which is /home, and it maps to this view, which is views.home page, right? And because it came to this home view, we told this to return a HTTP response of hello world. That is why we can see hello world in the browser. Now, I want you to notice something. If I now come to my project settings.py file and I type in some text like test, right? And I put /, it would mean that if I want to visit or any URL inside the authentication app, I have to give it a prefix of test / before I visit any URL in the authentication app. Now, because this is /home, it would mean I need to first of all in my browser visit test, then /home before I can visit this home page. Now, if I try to refresh here, you are going to see we have page not found. But the moment I go to test /home, you are going to see that we have hello world present there. So that is just basically why That is just basically how URLs work. But for now, I am just going to leave this empty because I do not want to put any prefix there. So when I check to see if my server is running, I will just go back here and I will go to /home, and I can see that it works. So now, after that explanation, what I just want to do next is, we're going to proceed to the next step. And the next step is we are now going to be writing all the code, which is going to help us register a new user, or, register a new user, or log in a new user. Now, that is the whole purpose of us creating this application called authentication. We're going to be writing all of the code which handles logging in and registering inside the authentication directory. Now, I realized that I hadn't actually explained how this view works. So, for people who don't fully understand how this view works or how this function works, in Django, anytime you want to create a new view, we have two types of views. We have the class-based views and the function-based views. But in this tutorial, we're going to be working with the function-based views. Now, it works very simple or very similar to how you create a normal function. Now, we have a function called home, and it takes in a parameter called request. Now, this request parameter basically contains all the information about the incoming request. Now, a request basically means when I visit the browser and I go to that specific endpoint, I am actually making a request to the server to get a response back. So what I am actually doing when I try to load up a web page is I am making a get request. Now, a get request basically means you are trying to ask the server for something. And when we are visiting this endpoint, we're basically telling the server, okay, I want to see the contents that is present at this specific endpoint. So that is a get request. And when we pass in the request parameter, it basically contains all the information about the incoming request. So it contains, like, for example, it contains the request method. Now, the request method could be get, post, put, patch, delete, depending on which one that the client sends. It could also, the request also contains, the request parameter also tells us whether the user is authenticated or not. We can also get the IP address of the, or we can also get the IP address of where the request is currently coming from. So the request parameter contains a lot of information about the incoming request. Now, I already explained what this does. We're just returning a HTTP response, and we're returning some text to the endpoint. What we're going to do is, I'm just going to delete this, head to my URLs and delete this. We are going to create two specific views. Now, each of these views are going to help us perform some specific tasks, which are going to be register and login. So I am going to create a new view called register. And in here, I'm just going to pass in request. I'll put my colon here and put pass for now. And I'm going to do the exact same thing. I'll create a new login user. I'll create a new view and call it login_user. And this is going to also take in requests. And I'm going to put pass here. So let's actually make this a lowercase r instead of uppercase r. Now, I wanted to also inform you guys that we are going to be working with HTML files, which I have already actually prepared ahead of time for this video. Now, if you want to get all these HTML files as well as the CSS file, there's going to be a link in the description, which is going to take you to a GitHub repository where you can get these files. Now, it is important that you get these files so that you can follow along with us. They are just basically HTML files, the HTML and CSS file, which is going to help us work on this feature. For example, if I open the login.html file, you are going to see how it looks in this browser. So you see that this is basically how the HTML file looks, and we are going to be working with this file when we are building this project. So I'm just going to close it. I just wanted to let you guys know. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to move all of these HTML files into our Django project, which is right here. Now, before I move them, I need to actually create a folder which is going to house all of these HTML files. And in Django, anytime you are working with HTML files, you need to keep them inside a specific folder called templates. So what I will do is inside my base directory where I have my manage.py file, I will create a new folder and call it templates. TEMPLATES. Now, inside this templates folder, this is where we are going to be keeping all our HTML files. Now, because I want to keep all the HTML files for authentication, which are going to be the login and register, because I want to keep all of them in only one place to make this very modular, I am going to create a different folder inside template and call it authentication. Now, once I do that, you can see that I have a folder called authentication inside the templates folder. So what I will now do now is move those HTML files inside authentication folder. So I will just proceed to do that now. So I have moved them into the authentication folder right now. And you can see that I have the login.html. Let me zoom it here. You can see I have the login.html and register.html files, which are present in my template directory. So I'm just going to save my views file and close my project URLs. Now, there's something that we need to do after importing these files into our templates directory. In Django, anytime you are working with templates, we need to register this templates folder in our settings.py file in order to let Django know that, okay, we have a folder called templates, which we are going to be saving HTML files from. So go to your settings.py file and scroll down. For where you see templates, go to this line where you see DIRS, and in quotes, I want you to type templates. So we're just trying to let Django know that we have HTML files present in a folder called templates. So make sure templates is typed in TEMPLATES and make sure it matches exactly the folder name which we give the template. So just save that and close your settings. So now that we have set up our settings.py file to tell Django where to find our template, we now need to return the actual HTML file, which is going to be used in our register view. I'm going to remove this pass and I'm going to say return render. Now you can see that this render was installed or was imported by default for us when we created the Django project. I'm actually just going to get rid of HTTP response. Now, what render basically helps us do is that it helps us return HTML files back to the client as a request. So what that means is that anytime we now visit our browser on, let's say, the register page, it is going to help us return a HTML file back to the front end. And you're going to see how that will work. So the first thing we need to pass in is request. Now, after passing in request, we need to pass in the location of where that template file is. Now, if I go to our templates, you can see that the register.html file is inside a folder called authentication. So by default, Django will always look at, or it will always look for the templates folder. So we don't have to automatically write, we don't have to specify template inside this file path. What we do need to specify is the file path of the specific HTML file after the templates folder. So because it is inside authentication, I'm going to write that first. So it's going to be authentication /register.html. Now note that the name of the file is register.html, and that is exactly what I typed in here. So I can just copy this and do the exact same thing for my login user view. But instead here, I'm going to change this to login. Oops, sorry. Let me just edit this. This is going to be login.html, and you can see it is the exact same thing. So once I save it right now, the next thing that I can just do is go to my urls.py file, and I can map these two views, register and login user, to URLs. So what I will just do next is I'll create a URL path, and I'm going to say path, and in here, I'm just going to put register /. So it would mean that anytime a user wants to visit the register endpoint, they are going to go to our base URL, and our base URL is localhost port 8000, which is 127.0.0.1 port 8000 / register. Now, once we've typed in the URL path, we then need to map it to a view. I'm going to say views.register. Now, after passing in the register, we need to give this view a name. Now, if you don't understand why, we need to give this URL a name. If you don't understand why we are giving this URL a name, I want you to just, bear with me for now. I am going to explain it eventually, and you'll see exactly why we're giving it a name. But I want you to just have it in mind that a name is a unique identifier for a specific URL. So it helps us identify that specific URL from, like other URLs in our project. I'm just going to type name is equals to register, GISTER. Now I'm going to put a comma here and do the exact same thing for login. So this is going to be path, and this will be login forward slash, and I'll put a comma here and say views dot login user, and I'm going to put the name as login. Right. So that is all we're going to do for now, and I am going to save it. Now, once I save it, I want to make sure that my server is still running. Now, once it starts running, I will go to my browser and I'm going to go to forward slash register, REGISTER. Now, once I visit this endpoint, you can see now that a HTML file is actually returned to us. We can see some text, register. We can see the first name, last name, username, email, password, and confirm password, as well as a button. Now, you can see that the HTML file is returned to us, but the styling isn't actually there. If I go to the file and open the register, at the top, you can see that it is actually linked to a CSS file, which is style.css. And if I head to the resources folder, which is where I had stored all the resources, if I go to the CSS folder, I can see that I have two CSS files, which are style.css and homestyle.css. Now, again, remember, if you want to get all of these files, there's going to be a link in the description, and it's going to be titled, like project HTML and CSS files. You can get those. You can use that link to download these files from, the GitHub repository, and we can proceed. So what we're just going to do is we're going to create a special folder inside our project. Now, this folder is going to be called static. Now, this is inside this folder where we're going to store all our all our CSS files. So the static files are basically are basically CSS files, JavaScript files, media files like images, pictures, videos. So we're going to be storing all of these files in our static directory or static folder. So at this point, I'm going to teach you how to set up static files in your Django project. So inside your root directory, again, where you have your manage.py file, I want you to create a new folder called static. And inside this folder, I want you to create a new one called CSS. Now, inside your static folder, remember that I said your static folder can store a bunch of different file types like CSS, JavaScript, images. It is important that we separate those, files into their own different folders so that we don't, confuse and put all of them in one specific place. So in this case, I have created a special folder just for CSS alone. So what I will do is I will head to the resources folder, and I will head to the CSS and copy all the CSS files which are in my resources. Again, you can get all these files by visiting the link where you can download them. And I'll head to my project folder where I have my manage.py file. I will go to static, CSS, and I'm going to paste these files right here. So once I have pasted these files, I can then go back to my Visual Studio Code and I can see these files are there. Now, what I need to do then is I need to head back to my template file. And where I have register.html, instead of just passing in the link, the first thing I'm going to do is I'll come here and put load static, or I'll type load static. So this is a special kind of template tag that tells Django that lets Django know that we want to make use of this static template tag right here. And what it actually does is that it helps us locate CSS files or static files like CSS images, JavaScript, which have been stored in the static directory. So instead of just typing in CSS forward slash styles.css, what I would then do is come here, put a curly bracket, or you know what? The first thing that I'm going to do is I'm just going to copy this or cut it, and I'm going to open two curly brackets, and I'm going to put percentage signs. Sorry. And in between these percentage signs, I'm going to type static. And once I type static, I'm going to type quotes. And what I will do is paste the link to and paste the path to the CSS, to the CSS file. So what exactly are we doing here? We're telling Django to make use of the static keyword, or using the static keyword, we're trying to tell Django that our style.css file is inside the CSS folder, which is inside the static directory. So basically, if you follow the path, we have the static directory, we have CSS, and then we have style.css. That is essentially what we're doing. Using a static keyword, we're telling Django, okay, we have a style.css file, which is inside the CSS folder, which is inside the static folder. Now, once I save this, head back to my browser and refresh. I want you to notice what happens. You can see that our static file is still not loading. Now, there's one final configuration which we have to do in order to enable static files get displayed in our project. And that configuration is going to happen in our settings.py file. Now, remember that I said our projects folder basically helps us control everything in our project and basically helps us control a lot of configurations. You can see now that it is very useful. So I want you to scroll down up onto where you have static URL. So at this point, we are going to be putting a setting which will enable Django find our static files. So to proceed, the first thing that we need to do is actually import a library called OS. So I'm going to say import OS, which is short for operating system, and you are going to see why we need this library. So what we need to specify in our settings.py file is called static files dirs. Now, what this basically means is that we are letting Django know where our static files are in our project. So I want you to just type static static files dirs, right? And equates this to a tuple. So static files dirs, right? Now, once you do this, the next thing that we need to actually do is that we need to pass in the location of where we can find our static files. Now, remember that we created a folder called static. So we need to pass this folder, we need to type in the location of this folder into this place. Now, note that this static file dirs, it is a tuple, meaning it can take in a number of locations. So if you have your static files in scattered in different places of your project, I wouldn't recommend that. But if you have your static files in different locations of your project, you can type that in. So I'm just going to create a tuple inside the tuple, and this is going to be the first item. So this is going to be os.path.join. And what exactly do we want to pass in? We want to pass in base dir, and then we're going to put a comma and pass in static. So let me explain what we have here. So the first thing that we basically said is os.path.join base dir. Now, if you go up, we can see that we have base dir declared here. So this is going to give us the path to our present working directory, or our base folder for our, sorry, to give us the path to our projects directory or our base folder where we have the manage.py file. So this will give us the file path to the root directory where we have our manage.py file. That is what base dir means, meaning like the base folder or the base project. Now, once we've done that, we're now trying to use O as the path to join to create a file path which joins the base directory folder with the static folder. So you can notice that we have the static folder inside our main projects directory. So it should just give us, like the projects directory to our it will give us the file path to our projects directory /static, which is where we have all our static files. So just save that. Now, if you have any question, please don't hesitate to ask it in the comment section and I am going to reply you. So once you save that, head to your terminal to make sure that it is running. Now, once you see it, just head back to your browser, and once you refresh, you'll see that your static files are already showing. Now, I had already refreshed earlier, so that is why mine is already showing. So if yours for some reason isn't showing, please feel free to ask a question in the comment section and I am going to reply you. So you can see now that our static files have been set up basically. So what we're just going to do next is we are going to do the exact same thing for our login.html file. So I want you to go to your login file, and actually I'm just going to copy these two lines, and I'm going to go to my login.html file, and where I see this, I'm just going to replace it. So I'm just going to save that and close it. Now, the next thing that we're going to do is we are then going to write the code, which is going to help us register a new user. Now, you see that we have this form right here in the front end. Now, this form doesn't do anything yet. All it does is collect first name, last name, username, email, password, and confirm password. But this form doesn't actually do anything yet, and we want to make this interactive. So we're going to be writing a code which is going to collect all of this data using this form, send all this data to our backend. Our backend is going to process that data, save the user details and then save the user details in our database. Now you can see that we have a text here called error message. Now I just put this here as default. It's just going to be a placeholder. So when the user enters all their data, we're going to perform some little verification, like for example, making sure a user with that specific username doesn't exist, or making sure a user with that email doesn't already exist. So if those details already exist, we're going to display an error message right here at the top, which is why you see error message as which is why you see error message being displayed here. So if I go to the actual register file, you can see this is it here, error message being displayed here. So I just displayed it for now as a placeholder, but it won't always show. Now, if you are in Visual Studio Code, I want you to notice something. If you go to your Python file and go down, you can see your current Python interpreter which you are using, and you can see the virtual environment which has been activated. Now, I am currently in a wrong virtual environment. This is called Albania Tourism App, but that isn't the correct one. So I want you to click it. Now, once you click it, it will bring down all the virtual environments which you have created, and ours was Django to do list. So I'm just going to scroll down to find it. So you can see this is it right here, Django dash to do dash list. Now this is the virtual environment. So in case you are in a wrong virtual environment, all you have to do is just click this bottom place right here and scroll down and find your correct virtual environment. Now that is if you're in Visual Studio Code. So we're going to be proceeding now. The first thing that we need to do is we need to look at the structure of this HTML file. So we can see that we have a form, right? And this form has a method of post. So the reason why this form has a method of post is because we are trying to send data to the server. That is, when a user enters their details and they clicks register, what we're essentially doing is that we're trying to take all of that data and send this to our server, which is our Python Django application, which is then going to process all of those details, which is why it has a method of post. So when you see post, it means we are sending data to the server. Now we have a bunch of input fields here. Let's look at the structure. The first one has a type of text, and it has a name of first name. Now this attribute called name is very, very important, and it helps to act as a placeholder, or it helps to act as a key which stores a specific value. Now it acts as a dictionary. So for example, when a user submits this data, what Python actually does in the background, or what Django does in the background, is that it bundles all of the data which has been submitted into this form, and it stores it in like a key value pair object, like a dictionary. Now, the keys in that dictionary are going to be the name attributes which have been typed into the input fields. So if I want to access what the user typed inside this input field, I am going to access it using the key called first underscore name, because that is the name I give this attribute. Now, I'm sure you understand how dictionaries in Python work, how it is called, a key value pair. Dictionaries have keys and they are assigned to values. So in this case, in order to represent this properly in HTML, we give the specific input field a name attribute. Now, the first one is called first name. The second one is called last name. The third one is called username. Now, note that all of these have a type of text. So users can just type in text. For example, I can go here, I can go to the browser and type in, like whatever I want. Now we have the email field. This has a type of email, and this last one, the last two have type of password. So these last two are for password. The names are password and confirm password. Now notice that every single field has a tag or an attribute called required. What this basically means is that we can't submit the form until that specific field has been filled. So if I type register, you can see that I have to type something in here. Now, and if I type register, you can see it tells us please include an @ in the email address. So because we had put a type of email here, it notices that HTML notices that this isn't a valid email address. So I just wanted to give you like a rough structure of how the HTML file looks. So we're going to proceed right now to actually processing the incoming data from this form. But before we can do that, we need to add a few, we need to add one more configuration to this specific file before we proceed. The next thing that we need to add to this form is something called CSRF token. So I'm going to explain what a CSRF token is, but I just want you to follow with me. So I want you to put your curly brackets and your percent signs and type in CSRF underscore token. Now, what exactly is CSRF token? CSRF token is basically anytime you specify it in a Django form, it is going to be a hidden value that helps to let Django know that this post request is coming from this form, which is coming from this website. So this helps to prevent, like malicious parties from sending a post request from a totally different form to our from a totally different form to our server. So this is basically a way to authenticate that the request, which is coming from this form, is coming from our website. That is, if we don't add this CSRF token right now, it would mean that another like a hacker or an attacker can create a form on a totally different website and send a post request to this register endpoint, right? So we want to make sure that the only way this form is going to be valid and the only way the data from this form is going to be valid is when the data or the form is submitted from our own website, which is the front end right here. So once we've added CSRF token, the next thing that we need to do is now create a way to receive these details from the front end. That is, when a user clicks submit, they're going to be sending their first name, last name, username, email, password, and confirm password. So we need a way to actually grab all of this data. So the first thing that we're going to do is in the register view, the first thing we need to do is we need to check if there is an incoming post request. That is, we want to check if a user is actually sending or if a user has actually filled and submitted the form. So in order to do that, what we're simply going to say is if request dot method is equals to post. Now, what exactly does this mean? What we're simply doing here is we're checking if the incoming request has a method of post. Now, if we check the form, remember that I explained that when we're sending a request to a server, we're essentially sending a post request because we want to create a resource. We're trying to create something new, and we're also sending data, which is why the method is post. So in this view, we want to make sure that we are receiving a post request. That is, we want to check if the incoming request is a post request. Now, if it is a post request, what we just simply want to do is grab all of the data which has been submitted in the form, because a post request should only be sent to this register endpoint only when the form has been submitted. So we're going to work on getting the first name right here. So I'm just going to say first name. I'll create a variable and I'm going to grab that first name, that is the value that the user entered in this first name field using the name attribute. So you're going to see how I'm going to do it. I'm going to say first name is equals to request dot post dot get, and in here I'm going to pass in first underscore name. Now, the reason why I am passing in first underscore name right here is because that is the exact name which I gave this. So if, for example, it was first, first name together like that, I would come back here and make this first name also together like that. So the reason why I am able to do this is because I had explained earlier that the name attribute is going to act as a key, and the actual value which is typed into this input field is going to act as the value. So together, all of these values act like a key value pair, just like a Python dictionary. So that is exactly why we are doing this. So I'm just going to do the exact same thing for last name, username, email, password, and confirm password. So I will copy this line, and this is going to be last name, email, uh, first name, last name, username, email, password, and confirm password. So I will just rename this from first name to last underscore name. And if you are wondering how I did that, if you're in VS Code, you can highlight a specific word. And if you want to change all the occurrences of that word, you just press Ctrl D for each item you want to change. Now, because the next one is username, I'm just going to change it to user name. Let me make sure I have that correctly. So there's email here. Okay, there's username. Now the next ones are email, password, and confirm password. So I will change this to, let me just highlight it here. I'm going to change this right here to email. This is going to be password. Sorry. Mhm. So this is going to be password. And then the last one is going to be confirm password. So now what we have essentially been able to do is when the user then submits this form, we are able to grab all of the data which the user has entered using, by first of all checking the request method, and then we are now grabbing all of it by accessing the key. So in fact, what I can then do actually is come down here to print request.post. So when I print request.post, what this does is that it's going to return to us the entire request which was sent, or the entire body of this post request. So let me just make sure my server is running. Let me run it. Now, once my server is running, I will head to, let me just close this. I will head to my Chrome browser and I will refresh this. Now, after refreshing, I'm just going to pass in some details for first name, last name, password. So let's just click register. Now, when I click register, I can go back to my terminal. And what can you see? The first item is the CSRF middleware token. Now, this value, CSRF middleware token, it is present in that post request because we have specified right here CSRF token. So it is actually a hidden field which Django automatically inserts. So this is the CSRF middleware token, which helps us for security and ensuring that the post request is coming from our own website. Then we have the key first name, and it is equated to what I entered in the field. Then we have last name, it is equated to what I had entered in the last name field. We have the same for username, email, password, and confirm password. So we can now see that we are able to actually fully grab all of the user data which they have entered in that form. Now, the next thing that we now need to do is perform some basic validation. The first thing we want to check is we want to make sure that no user with that username or email exists. You know how when you go to Facebook, for example, if you try to register with a username that is already taken, it is going to show you an error saying, like, error, a user with that username already exists. So we're going to do just exactly that. So the first thing I'm going to do is import the user model. I'm going to say from django.contrib.auth.models import user. So this is the default user class which Django gives us, and we are going to make use of it. So instead of having to write our own user class, we're just going to make use of what Django has given us. Now we're going to be writing some if conditions to check if a user with this username or email already exists. So I'm going to write if user dot objects dot filter, and I'm going to say email, or let's start with username. I'm going to say username is equals to username. Now, what exactly does this mean? So we're saying check the database to see if a username with that user, if a user with that username which was just entered exists. So actually, you make use of the .exist method which Django gives us. So I can say .exist. So this is going to return to us a boolean, true or false. Now it's just going to first of all search through this. It's first of all going to filter the database, check for a user that matches this username. Now, dot exist is basically going to return true or false, meaning it's going to return true or false, which states whether a user actually, which states whether a user with that username exists or not. So that is why we're writing this query, user.object to filter, username is equals to username dot exist. Now, if that user exists, what do we want to do? We want to actually display an error message to the HTML form. Now, this is where we are going to make use of this error message text, which is right here. So what I'm going to do is, in order to actually create in order to actually generate error messages and return back to the front end, we are going to make use of a library, an inbuilt library called messages. So I'm going to say from Django does contrib con import messages. So basically, what messages helps us do is that they basically, or the library, or the method rather, basically just helps us display or render out messages in our front end. So you're going to see how we are going to, do it if you haven't learned how to make use of messages yet. So what we want to do is, if a user already exists with that username, we want to create a new error message telling the user that a user with that username already exists. We need a way to create this message and display it in the front end. And we're going to do that using the messages library. So in order to create a new error messages, I'm going to say messages.error. And the first thing that we're going to pass in is request. Then the next thing we're going to pass in is the actual error message. So I'm going to say a user with that username already exists. So this is going to be our error message. Now, the next thing that we now need to do is we need to actually redirect the user to the point where, we need to redirect the user to the page where we want them to view that error. Because, for example, now, what we have done here is we've checked if a user with that username already exists. So if a user with that username already actually exists, by just creating a new error message, but we haven't told Django where to display this error message. Where do we want to display the error message? We would like to redirect the user back to our register view and display that error message. So how exactly do we do that? We make use of the redirect method. So from Django.shortcut, I will just import redirect. Now, what redirect helps us to do is that it helps us to redirect it helps us redirect the user to certain endpoints. Now, what we want to do in this case is, if a user with that username already exists, we would like to create or generate a new error, and then we would like to redirect the user back to the register page and render out that error. Now, in order to make use of the redirect method, what we need to do is go to our URLs. Now, note that we gave our register URL a name of register. Now, this is going to be important. So in order to make use of this redirect method, what I am just going to do is say return redirect, and in quotes, I'm going to pass in register. Now, I am passing in register because we are essentially telling Django to redirect the user to a URL whose name is register. So Django is going to go to our URLs, search for a URL whose name is register. So once it finds it, it's then going to redirect the user to localhost port 8000/register, and then that user gets routed to this specific view. Now you might be wondering, okay, so we are redirecting the user back to our register view, but we haven't actually written code which is going to display or render out that error in the HTML page. As you can see right here, we just have error message being statically defined, but we need to write some code in our HTML file which is going to dynamically display these errors if there are any errors that have been created actually. So in order to do that, what we're going to do is go to the register.html file, and I'm going to write an if statement first. So I'm going to say if messages. So this is inbuilt, by the way, messages. So what happens is that anytime we create a new message by saying messages.error, this message is going to be accessible in the HTML file which we are redirecting to. That is why we are saying if messages. So we're just going to write an if statement to check if there is actually a message which has been created. So if there's a message which has been created, we are then going to render it out. Now, again, in Django, anytime you write an if statement, you always have to have an end block. I'm going to put an end if here. So let me just cut this for now. Actually, I'm going to cut it. Now, inside these if messages, inside this if block, we want to look through all the messages which have been generated, right? That is, it is possible to generate more than one error message before finally redirecting to, before finally redirecting to the register page. And that is exactly what we're going to do. So let's just see how it will go. Now, in the register page, after checking if there are any messages, we're going to write a for loop to loop through all the messages which have been created. Because what I can do is I can come down here and create as many messages. Sorry, I can come down here and create as many messages as I want. So all of these are actually valid. It will just mean that I am creating 3 messages. And what I want to do in that case is I would like to look through all the messages which have been generated. Now you are going to get the full picture, but let's just proceed. So I'm going to put my percentage signs there. I'm going to say for message in messages, right? Then I'm going to put my end for as usual, because anytime you declare a block of code in the Django templating language, you have to always put the end block. Now for message in message, this is when I will now finally paste this text right here. But instead of displaying error message, I'm just going to put curly brackets there and type message. So what I have essentially done is I'm saying for message in messages. So I am looping through the messages which have been generated and I am rendering out that message right here. But you might then ask yourself, but is it only error messages that we can create, using the messages framework? And that is actually not true. We can actually create success messages by saying messages.success, right? As you can see, messages.success. So that might now be a problem because right here, the style has been set to red. So it would mean that even if we generate a success message from here, it will always show as red. So in order to actually change the color based on what kind of message it is, we can then cut it again and we can write an if statement to check if it is an error message or if it is a success message. So I'm just going to create my curly brackets in here and I'm going to say if message dot tags is equals to error. Now I'm going to explain what this means, but just follow me and I'm going to put an end if here. So what are we doing here? We are saying if message.tags is equals to error. So this is how to check the status or this is how to check what kind of message it is. We have message.info, we have message.success, we have info messages, we have success messages, we have error messages. I think we also have debug messages. In order to check what kind of tag an error, in order to check what kind of tag a message has, whether it has an error, whether it is an error message, a success, debug, or info, we can do that by checking message.tags. So when we say if message.tags is equals to error, we're simply checking if it is an error message. And if it's an error message, we're just going to display the message right here, and the color is going to be fire brick. Now, what if it is no longer, or what if it isn't an error message? What I would just like to do is write an else here, right? I'm going to write an else here, and inside the else, I will display the same message, but this time, instead of the color being fire brick, it's going to be Dodger blue, Dodgerblue. So Dodger blue looks almost like sky blue, but it's a blue color. So if the error isn't an error message, it would render out as blue. So this is the exact way to render out messages in your HTML file. Now let's head back to the views and make a few changes. Now at this point, if you have any question concerning what we have done so far, please feel free to ask in the comment section and I will get back to you. Now that we are in the views, let's make a few changes to the code which we have here. Now what we have here, the moment the user checks or the moment the code checks if a user with a username already exists, it generates a new error and we redirect the user back to, back to the register page. But what we want to do is we want to first of all validate all of the data and generate as many errors as possible before finally returning the user back to the register page. So we are going to check if the username already exists. Okay, if a user with that username already exists, we generate an error. If a user with that email already exists, we generate an error. And then if, like for example, the password is not equal to confirm password, we also generate an error. And it is after all those errors have been generated before we now redirect the user to the register page. So let me just move this out of here for now. And I'm going to create a flag. And this is going to be called user data as error. And first of all, I'm going to set it to false. Now, the reason why we're creating this flag is so that we can tell whether there was an error when validating the data or not. So you are going to see exactly why we need this, but just follow with me. So I'll copy this line right here, and I am going to, let me just zoom in here, and I'm going to paste it again. But in this case, I'm going to change this from username equals username to email equals email. So we're trying to check if a user with that email already exists. So in here, I'll change the error message to email, right? Now, what I will do next is after checking if the username and email exist, we are going to check if the password is less than 5 characters. That is, if the length of the password is less than 5 characters. So what I will do then is I'm going to say if len password, right, is less than 5. That is, if the number of characters that the user entered is less than 5, we're going to generate a new error, and we're going to tell them your password, or let's just say password, must be at least 5 characters, right? Now, after checking the length of the password, the last thing we're going to check for is if the password and confirmed password are equals to each other. So these are just like very simple, very basic, verifications that we can perform on our data. But obviously, you can go ahead and perform like more complex verifications if you want. Like for example, restricting users from a certain country or a certain location from registering. I'm going to say if password not equals to confirm password, then I'm going to generate a new error by saying messages.error, and I'll pass in request here and say passwords do not match. Now remember that I said we were going to create a flag here, right? User data has error. Now what we want to do is after generating each error, we're going to set it to true. That is, if a user with that username already exists, we're going to set the user data flag, a user data has error flag to true. So at each stage, we're going to set it to true because, for example, the user could enter an email that doesn't exist here and user data has error will still be false. So this if condition will be skipped, right? So what we want to do is we want to make sure that we add this flag. We want to make sure that we set this flag to true at each step. I'm just going to paste it there, and then paste it there. So it would mean that at each stage, we are able to set the flag to true if indeed an error occurred. Now, the only time we want to redirect the user back to the register page is if there is actually an error. That is, this user data has error will only be true if some kind of error was encountered during the validation of the data. So I'm just going to write an if condition right here, and I'll say if user data has error, then I am going to return redirect to register. So by saying if user data has error, we're basically trying to say find out if it is true. And if true means obviously if true is true, then perform this. So if this value is true, we're going to redirect the user back to the register page. So let's save that and actually test it out. So let's make sure the server is running and head back to the browser. So when you're on your browser, I want you to refresh. Now, when you refresh, you notice that that error message is gone. So let's try to enter like a username. Let's try to enter, let's say, passwords that do not match, right? Now let's click register and see what happens. Okay, we are having an error saying no such table auth underscore user. Now the reason why I'm having this error is because if I go to my terminal, you will see that we have been getting this error saying you have 18 unapplied migrations. Your project may not work properly. Now that is because we haven't actually, migrated so that the changes which were automatically created for our database haven't been applied yet. So we need to migrate in order for those changes to be applied. And those changes includes setting up the database tables for our default Django user class. So I'm going to say Python manage.py migrate. Oops, this is supposed to be lowercase. Python manage.py migrate. Now once I do that, it will just migrate all the database tables. I am going to clear and then run my server again. So once I do this, you can see that that error is gone. So I will just head back to my browser and refresh. So once that is back up, I will try again and enter details that do not exist. So once I do that and click register, you can see that we have this saying passwords do not match. Now this is displaying twice because I clicked the button register twice. Let's do that once, and I'm going to click it once. You can see now that it says passwords do not match, but there is a typo here. So let me head back to my code to actually fix it. So PASSWORDS, passwords do not match. So we can see now that our code is actually able to check for, sorry, we can see now that our code is actually able to check for errors to actually verify that the data is correct. That is the username, no user with that username exists, no user with that email exists, as well as other details. Now we could even add an if condition to make sure that all this data, all these items are filled. So for example, remember that in our inputs, in our HTML file, we had set every field to required. Now, what somebody could technically do is just go to the browser, inspect elements, go here, inspect the form. Now once they get to that form, they can just come here, edit the HTML, right? And they can keep doing that for all the fields. They can come here, remove the required attributes, and once they do that, it will actually update the code in the browser, so they will be able to send that post request. So it's very easy for somebody to just inspect, remove this required attribute and send that post request. But what we can do is we can also write an if condition to prevent that. So we can say if not, and in here, I'm going to type in first name and last name and username and email and password and confirm password. Then we're just going to say messages dot error, and then this is going to be request first, and then we're going to say all, the error is going to be all fields are required, and then we're going to say the user data has error. Oops, sorry, user data has error to true. So what this basically does is that when we say if not first name and last name and username, so when we put these details here, this variable first name and last name and username, the only case where this value would equate to false is when one of the fields are not, it is when one of these variables are not assigned to any value. So when we do request or post or get username, if no value was actually sent for username, none would be allocated to this username variable by default. So the moment username here is none, it would mean that this entire operation inside this parenthesis would be false. Then we're saying if not false, then we are going to run this. I hope you understand that. We're just essentially checking if all the fields have been filled here. But if they've not been filled, then we are are going to generate this error. So that's basically how you can like add your own, verification and verify all the data. Now we need to move to the next step, right? So after we've performed all the validation on this data, what we now want to do next is simply create the user objects in our database. That is, when we verify that the data is correct, what do we want to do? We then want to create a new user. I'm going to create a new variable and I'll call it user is equals to user, which is our user class, which you just imported. User.object dot create underscore user. Now, what do we want to pass in here? The first thing that we are going to pass in is the username. Sorry, it's going to be username is equals to username. Email is equals to email. Password is equals to password, right? And then first name is equals to first name, and last name is equals to last name. So what we're simply doing here is we're trying to make use of the create underscore user method, which this user class gives us by default. And that user class is what we had imported at the top. So what we're simply doing is, okay, we're trying to create a new variable and say user.objects will create user. And we're passing in the values username, email, password, first name, and last name. So we can actually test this out to actually see if it works. So what I would do is, what we need to do next is we need to actually create a new super user so that we can view our admin dashboard. So I will just break out of my terminal, clear the screen, and run python manage.py create super user. Now, if you don't know what is happening here, basically Django gives us an admin dashboard which we can use to visualize all the data in our database. It's actually a fairly complex dashboard which allows us manage all our data within a Django admin dashboard, which Django gives us by default. So you are just going to run this command in order to create an admin which can access that dashboard. So the username is going to be admin. I'll press enter to skip the email address, and then I'm going to enter a password of, let's just say, admin, password again. I'll enter that. So now we can see that our super user has been created successfully. So I'll just clear my screen and run the server again. So once the server is running, I will go back to my browser and I will go to localhost port 8000/admin. Now I'm going to be redirected to this page to log in. So just make use of those credentials which you had just created in the terminal. I'm going to type in the password right here. Now, once I do that, you can see that we are brought to the Django admin dashboard. And we can see two models, groups and users. Now, this is the user module which we are working with. So I am going to click into it. So right now, you can see that we have, let me zoom in here. We have only one user object, which is admin, which I had just created from the admin dashboard. So what I will then do is I will come right here to my, let me just refresh. I will come right here to my register form and I will actually register a new user. So let's enter the name, the full name. So I'm going to change the username to test user, right? And I'll enter a correct, what's it called? A correct password. And then confirm password. Now I want you to notice what happens when we click register. So when we click to register, the page reloaded. But what we can actually do is go to our admin and refresh. Now, once we refresh, we can see that that user isn't actually getting displayed in our admin dashboard. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to debug and find out why that user isn't getting saved in the database. So let's head back to the code and check. So the reason why we aren't having the reason why that user isn't getting saved is because we actually haven't called the .save method. So I'm meant to say user.save so that we can actually save the user by calling, when we call user.objects.create user, we need to call the .save method to actually save that user in the database. So let's check if the server is still running. So we see that it's still running. I'm going to head back to my browser, get back here and refresh. Now, after refreshing, I'm just going to type in those details again. I'm going to put in my, okay, I think I made a mistake. I'm going to put these details in right here. And once I click register, it now says a user with that username already exists because the username which I selected was admin. I'm just going to change username to test user. And then the password, I'm going to change to something else, which is going to be testing. And the confirm password is going to be testing also. So once I hit register, I can then go to my database and refresh, or the admin dashboard. And once I refresh the admin dashboard, you can see that we now have a new user which exists in the admin dashboard. And we can see that it's the username I use, test user, the email I use, the first name, last name, and so on. So I can actually click into that user and I can see all the details. So that is exactly how we can make use of, that is exactly how our register feature is going to work, where users will be able to register. So that is exactly how our register feature is going to work. So we're going to be proceeding now to actually the login feature. But before I move to the login feature, I want you to notice what happened. When I clicked register, notice that we were redirected back to the register page. So what we are going to do is we are going to write some code which is going to redirect the user to the login page the moment they register. So the user is going to get redirected to the login page and a success message is going to be displayed telling the user that account successfully created, proceed to login. Now we are going to change the redirection of how the user, we're going to change the redirection of the user flow. But for now, we are going to proceed to write the login user feature. And we are going to connect the register view to redirect the user to the login view after a user object has been created. So we are going to see how this will work, but let's proceed. Now, the next step we're going to take is we're going to open the login.html file, and it's basically the exact same thing. We have this error message feature being displayed. So we're just going to go to our register.html, and I'm going to copy all of it, go to my login, and I will replace this with all of it. Sorry. And I'm going to paste that here. So basically, this is going to help us also dynamically render out messages in our login.html page. Now, the next thing is we need to add CSRF token, like I explained earlier, CSRF underscore token, right? Now, we need to take note of two things, that these two fields are required as per usual, and they both have a name attribute of username, and the second one has a name attribute of password. So I want you to save that and head back to views.py file. But before we actually start writing, there's something I want you to notice. Notice that we have this text here by saying already have an account, login, and on the login page, if I go to the login.html, it says not a member, sign up. Now, because we have the URL set up, that is name of register and name of login, we can actually link these pages together in the front end. So I can scroll down to already have an account, and right here, instead of login.html, I'm going to put a URL. So I'm going to put my curly brackets and percent signs. I'm going to type URL. And after typing URL, I'm going to type in the name of that specific URL which we want to redirect the user to. Now, because we are on the register page, we want a case where when the user clicks login, they are taken to the login page. Now, because the name of this login URL is called login, I'm just going to go to the register and type login. So this is exactly how to work with URLs in Python and Django. If you want to redirect the user to a specific view, you first of all have to take note of the URL which is mapped to that view, and you have to give that URL a name. So it is the name attribute of that view, of that URL which maps to the view that you are going to pass into the quote right here. So I am going to save it and do the same thing for the login. So instead of typing in register.html, I'm going to put my curly brackets, percent signs. I'm going to say URL of register. So once I save that and actually refresh, let's refresh. I can now click this login button and you can see I am brought to my login page. And I can click the sign up button and you can see I am brought to my sign up page. So I just wanted to show you how to do that. Now in our views.py file, in our login user view, we expect that the user is going to, or the client or the form is going to be sending the username and password. So we're going to do the exact same thing which we did in our register view. I'm just going to come down here. I'm going to write if request.user, if request.method is equals to post. Then what are we going to do after checking if it is a post request? We're going to grab the username, and that will be request.post.get, and in here we're going to pass in username, and we're going to do the exact same thing, but in this case it is going to be called password. WORD. So in this case, we are getting both the username and the password. So after getting these details, after checking if it is a post request and getting these details, what we now need to do is actually check if these details were entered, because obviously, if these details were not entered, then there's nothing to authenticate and there's nothing to validate. So I'm just going to check if username, if not username and password. That is, if the user didn't enter, these details, that is username and password, then we're going to generate a new error. And this is going to be messages.error, and we're going to pass in requests. And after passing in requests, we're going to say all fields are required. So what we've essentially done here is we're checking if the username and password are empty. That is, if not username and password, we are going to generate a new error message. And contrary to what we did here, we're just going to return an error immediately back to the front end to let them know that, okay, what you are doing is wrong. You aren't actually meant to return. No, you actually aren't meant to, submit this form with empty data. I'm just going to return redirect, and we're going to redirect to login. Now, if I go to my URLs, notice that the login URL has a name of login, which is why I am passing in login here. So this will ensure that both username and password are entered. Now, the next thing that we need to do is now actually authenticate these details to see if they are actually correct. That is, when they send their username and password, we need to actually be sure that a user with these credentials actually exists in our database. Now, in order to do this, we are going to scroll to the top and import a few inbuilt methods. So I'm going to first of all import authenticate. So I'm going to say from django.contrib.auth import authenticate login. So let's just import those two for now, authenticate and login. Now, if we scroll to the bottom, what we now need to do is actually authenticate and check if these user details, authenticate and check if these user details are correct. That is, if a user with this username and password actually exists. And we can do that using the authenticate method. So I will come down here and I'm just going to write an if condition. Or first of all, before writing an if condition, I will create a new variable and I'll say user is equals to authenticate. Now just follow with me. I'm going to explain exactly what is happening. So user is going to be equals to authenticate. And then we're going to say request is equals to request. Username is equals to username. And then the last thing which we are going to pass into this place is password. Password is equals to password. Now let's look at exactly what we are doing and what the authenticate does. Now what the authenticate method does is that it takes in a group of parameters, right? As you can see here, okay, before I explain that, let me just explain. But before I look at this, let me just explain. The authenticate method takes in three parameters: request, username, and password. And what it does is that it checks the database to see if a user with this username and this password exists in the database. Now, if it exists in database, it is going to return that user object back to where this authenticate method was called. Now, that is exactly why we have created a variable and called it user and equated this to this authenticate method. Now, if no user with these credentials were found in database, it is going to return none back to where this method was called. Now, if I hover over it, you can see that it says if the given credentials are valid, return a user object. That is exactly what happens. So if the credentials, username and password are correct, it's going to return that user object. But if it is not valid, then it is going to return none. So what we now need to do is we need to write an if statement to check if the user is not known. That is, we need to check if those credentials actually exist in the database. What we're going to say is if user is not known, that is, if the credentials are correct, then we are going to say login of request, comma, user. That is, we want to log in the current user into our website. So after logging in the user into our website, we are then going to write some code later on which will redirect the user to home page. So this is exactly what we're going to do later. We're going to write some code which will redirect the user back to the home page. Now, in the case where the user is indeed none, that is, if no user with those credentials were found, what we're just going to do is we are going to write an else here, and then we're going to create a new error message. I'm going to say messages.error. We're going to pass in request, and then we're going to type here invalid, invalid username or password. And then we're going to redirect the user back to the login page so that they can view the error which was just generated. Now, once I save that, we can actually test this view out with invalid credentials. So let me just make sure it is running. Then I'll go back to my browser and I will refresh it. Now, once I refresh it, I can actually enter wrong credentials, like testing 123, for example, or 124. And I can enter like some random credentials. Now, once I click login, notice what happens. You can see that we have an error saying invalid username or password. The reason why we're seeing this error is because we entered an invalid username and password. That is, no user with those credentials actually exists. So what it now did was it came to this else block, generated the error invalid username. So this is supposed to be NAME, invalid username or password, and then we redirected the user back to the login page. Now, what we just need to do next is we need to create a page where we are going to, redirect the user to after they successfully login, so that we can, obviously, when a user logs into a website, they get redirected from the login page to like the home page. Now, we are going to do just exactly that. But before we do that, remember that I said we are going to change the flow of the program where once the user registers, they get redirected to the login page to log in with those credentials they just used. So after saving the user object, what we're going to do next is generate a new success message. I'm going to say messages.success, right? And in here, I'm going to pass in requests. And after passing in request, I'm going to say account created successfully. successfully. Account created successfully. Then I'm going to put a comma, login. Then after doing this, I will redirect the user to the login page. So I'm going to say return redirect. And in here, I'm going to pass in login, right? I'm just going to save that. So what this essentially is doing is that the moment the user object has been created, I'm going to save that user object, we're going to create a new success message saying account has been created successfully, comma, login, and then we're going to redirect the user to the login page. Now, because we have already written some templating code, which is going to help us check for messages and check if it is an error message or if it is a success message. This message is going to be displayed using this color of Dodger blue. So let's make sure everything is saved. So we're just going to test this out. So I am going to go to my browser and go to the sign up page. And I'm going to sign up with totally different credentials. So I'm going to say test user 2 and a different email. Make sure the passwords match. And I'm going to click register. Now notice what happens when we click register. Okay, so we are having an error saying username, unique constraint field, user underscore username. So let me just actually refresh to see. I think I might have, yeah, I think I pressed that, what's it called? I pressed the register button twice. So I'm going to go back and refresh. So once I do that, I'm just going to type in test user 2, and I'm going to put in a random email here, for example, and then I'm going to put in the password and then the password. So let's hit register and see what happens. So once I hit register, you can see that we now have this success message saying account successfully or account created successfully, comma, login. So what that means right now is that our code is able to successfully register the user, create a success message, and redirect the user to the login page, telling them that they need to log into our website. So what I'm just going to do now is I am just going to go back to my views, and I will create a test view, the one I said earlier, where we want to redirect the user to after the login. I'm going to create a new view and I'll call it home, right? And this is going to take in request. So what we're just simply going to do is we're going to return a HTTP response. Let me scroll to the top and say from Django.http import HTTP response right there. So I'm just going to return a HTTP response, return HTTP response saying you are authenticated, meaning the user is logged in. Now, once I save that, I will just go to my urls.py file and I will create a new path. Let me just put a comma here to get rid of this error. And I'm going to leave this the URL path empty because I want this to be the base URL. That is when I go to localhost port 8000, I want to be saved this home page. Now I'm just going to say views.home and then the name is going to be home. So once I save that, it will now mean that I can go back to my views and immediately after logging in the user, I can come down here and say return redirect home. Now you might ask yourself, this view is publicly accessible. That is, if I go to my browser right now and I remove that URL, if I go to the localhost port 8000, you can see that you are authenticated is clearly displayed right there. So even though I am not logged in, for example, if I go to my admin dashboard and log out, if I come back here and refresh, you can see that I can still access the page even though I am not logged in. So what we want to do is we want to prevent any user who is not, any user who is not logged in from accessing this page. So we're going to import a decorator, which is going to help us set this. So I'm going to say from django.contrib.auth.decorators import login required, login underscore required. Now, once we do that, just scroll down to the bottom. So that view which we are trying to add, we're just going to say at login required. And I'm going to click save. Now, the final thing that we need to do in order to make this work is we need to head to our settings.py file and we need to specify the login URL. Now, the login URL is basically where Django will redirect the user to when they try to visit a page which requires authentication and they are not authentic. So, for example, when you try to access a website and you are trying to access a URL which requires that you need to be logged in. Now, once you access that URL, it's going to redirect you back to the login page telling you need to log in before you can actually access that specific. Now, this is exactly what the login URL is. Django is going to look for this URL in our settings.py file. So we're going to tell Django, okay, if a user is trying to access a page and they are not logged in, redirect the user to the login URL, which has been specified in the settings. So it's just basically login underscore URL, and it is equals to the name of the URL, which actually handles logging in, and the name is login. So I'll just go to my settings and type login. So once I save that and make sure my server is running, if I head to my browser now and refresh, notice what happens. You can see that we immediately get redirected to the login page because we have told Django in our views.py file that we want to only make sure that the user must be logged in before they view this specific page. And in our settings, we have specified that the login URL is a URL whose name is login. So that is exactly how to restrict a page from being viewed if they are not authenticated. So if they are then authenticated, that is when a user logs in, we're then going to redirect the user to the. So let us actually test the flow. I'm going to come here to sign up as a new user. So let me just pick like some random details here. Like for example, let's just put a random email there, and the password is going to be testing testing. So the username instead of admin is going to be let's just say admin. No, not admin. Let's just say Lemos1, right? So let me just copy that so that I don't forget. Now, once I hit register, you'll see that we are being brought to the login page. It says account successfully created, login. So I'm going to paste the username which I have just created and put in the password which I have just created. Now, if I try to enter login credentials and invalid login credentials, it will show us an error as we saw before. But I will just enter correct credentials. So when I click login, notice what happens. You'll see that we get redirected to localhost port 8000. Sorry, let me just go back. Uh, okay, yeah. So you see that we get redirected to localhost port 8000 and it says you are authenticated. Now we are able to see this because we've been successfully able to log in. Now, once we logged in, we redirected the user back to the home page. Now, there's something else that we need to do. You can see that once we are logged in, we need a way to actually be able to log out. So we are going to create a logout endpoint or a logout view in our code. And so proceeding to write the logout endpoint, what I'm just going to do is I'm going to create a new function or a new view which will handle this. And I'll first of all say def logout user. So I am going to call the view logout underscore user. And as usual, this will take in request. Now, before we can actually proceed, we need to import a certain method from Django, which will help us log out a user. And that is going to come from django.contrib.auth import logout. Now note that you can see that everything is logout in lowercase. Now that is exactly why I didn't call this our method logout. For example, if I had called this method logout, or this our view name, if I had called it logout, it would clash with what we had already imported here. So it is important that you always name your functions and variables different from your imports. If not, you're going to have issues. Now, all we simply need to do is just simply log out the user. I'm going to call logout of request. So when we call logout of request, this will just log out the user from our website, and all the sessions that have been created will be destroyed. So therefore, they won't be valid anymore, and the user would have to relog in. So the next thing is, after logging out the user, I will just redirect the user to the login page so that they can log in again, obviously, because they have been logged out. So I'm going to call return redirect, and in here, I'm going to pass in login because we want the user to log in again after they have been logged out. So what we need to do next now is we need to map this logout user view to a URL endpoint. So I'm going to copy it and I will head to my urls.py file. Now, right after login, I will create a new path. And in here, I'm going to call the URL path logout. And this is going to be views.logout user. And then the name of this URL is going to be logout. So that would ensure that users are able to access this logout endpoint. Now, once I save it, we've been successfully able to map this view to a URL. Now, I want you to notice something. Right here in the home page, we're returning a HTTP response of "you are authenticated." And when I get there and refresh, you can see "you are authenticated" being printed out. What we also want to do is we want to add the logout URL. That is, we want to add a link which the user can click to log out. Now, what I could do first of all is create a new HTML file and just put in, the HTML code which will enable us log out. But what I can just do for now, or what I mean is I could just put in HTML code to make it, look a bit beautiful and put like a logout button. But what I can just do for now is just add that link right here in the HTTP response. So what I can actually do is I can type in some HTML code into this return HTTP response, and the browser will actually render that out as HTML content, and you're going to see how it will be. Now, because we want to redirect the user, because we want to put a link which will take the user to the logout endpoint. What we are simply going to do is just create an anchor tag. I'm going to put an anchor tag here, and I'll say href is equals to, and in here, so let's just make this double quotes. And then the next thing that we are going to do is inside this anchor tag, we're just going to put a URL which would go to the logout endpoint. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to give space and put quote here. And the endpoints that we want to go to is logout, right? Because we want to go to localhost port 8000 /logout, because that is the URL endpoint which we had specified in our urls.py file. Now, after putting the URL, we're just going to put some text there saying log out user, or let's just call it logout. And I'm going to close this anchor tag. Now, the reason why I am not just putting this in a HTML file, in its own separate HTML file, is because then that would be a longer process of having to create the HTML file and then rendering it by calling return render. But this is just like much more straightforward. So in order to make it look better, I'm just going to put a line break tag here. So it would take this link to the next line. So once I save that and make sure my server is running, I will just head to the browser and refresh. Now, once I refresh, what can you see? You see it says you are authenticated, and there is a link that links to the logout endpoint. Now, that is being generated from here because we told this to display you are authenticated, and then we told it to put a line break, and we told this to display the logout link. So notice what happens when I click it. Now, once I click logout, you see that we are immediately taken to the login page. Now, if I try to access that home page now and I try to access it, you see that we are being redirected back to the login page. Now, that is because we have told Django that in order to view this home page, you need to be logged in. Now, we just need to add one more check to our view to make sure that an authenticated user is not visiting the login endpoint or the register endpoint. That is, if a user is already logged into the website, there is no reason for them to be able to access your login page because they are already logged in. So we can write a simple if condition and say if request dot user dot is underscore authenticated. That is, if the user is already authenticated, if they are logged in, then we want to redirect them to the home page. So I am just going to say return redirect, and in here I'm just going to pass in home. So if a logged in user tries to visit this home page, for example, now tries to if a logged in user tries to visit the login page, they're going to get redirected to the home page. And I can do the exact same thing right here in the register endpoint. So it's just first of all check if this user is logged in. If they are not, if they are indeed logged in, it will redirect them to the login page, to the home page, I mean. So let's save that. Now, once I save this, we can actually test this code. So let's log into the website using the credentials that we had created for the admin user. Now, once I am logged into the website, notice that if I go to / login now, you'll see that we get redirected back to the home page. And if I go to / register, you're going to see that we get redirected back to the home page because we're already logged in. So I can just go to logout. Now, the next thing that we are going to do is now actually work on the blog part of it. Sorry, not blog, the to-do list part of it, right? So we have finished all the authentication for the project. So users can now log in and register into our website. Now, the next step is we now need to move on to, after the authentication, we need to move on to the to-do list section, actually, the part that is going to be handling, or the part that is going to enable users create to-do lists, view this to-do list, mark them as completed, or even, delete the to-do list. Now, what we are going to do is we're going to create a new application. So I want you to go to your terminal and stop your server. So let me just clear out my screen. And I'm going to create a new application, and I'll say Python manage.py start app, and I'll call it to do app. So this app is going to be where we are going to write majority of the code, which will contain the functionality of allowing users to add new to-do lists, update to-do lists as completed. Now, once I do that, I am just going to proceed to run my server. Now, once we go back to the code editor, let me just close all of these out because we're no longer working with them. Now, once I look at my projects or my folder structure, I can see a new folder called To Do App. Now, remember, I told you that anytime you create a new application, you need to register that application in your settings. So I will just go to my settings, scroll all the way to installed apps, and where I see installed apps, I'll put a comma there and add a new entry, and I'll call it To Do App, and I'll put a comma here. So I'm just adding this new application to my installed app so Django knows that we have a new application called To Do App. Now I will do the exact same thing, though we haven't created a urls.py file yet in To Do App. Since we're already inside this projects folder, we might as well just set up that URL, which we haven't created yet. So I'm just going to put a comma here, sorry, not that. And I'll copy this line and paste it. So instead of putting authentication, I'm going to put To Do App. So we're letting Django know that we are going to have a urls.py file inside our to-do app. So once we've done that, let's actually now create this file. So I'm going to say new file, and I'll call it urls.py. Now, as usual, we're going to say from Django.urls import path so that we can create endpoints which can access specific views. And I'm going to say from dot import views. So I'm just simply saying from this current working directory, import the views.py file so that we will be able to access our views. Then I'll create a new list and I'll call it URL patterns. Now equate this to an empty list for now and leave it like that. So now we've created our urls.py file. The next step we're now going to take is actually create models. Now these models are going to be the structure of how our to-do lists are going to look like. That is, what exactly is the structure of a to-do list? We know that the to-do list has to be created by a user. So every to-do list that is created has to be assigned to a specific user. We know that a to-do list has a timestamp, which signifies the day, the time it was created. Then we also have the actual content of the to-do list, that is the actual text which is written. That is, for example, let's say I want to wash dishes. The actual text or content is I want to wash dishes. So those are the three that we are going to be. Sorry, and the last one is going to be a Boolean field, which is going to tell us whether this to-do list is completed or not. So those are the four fields we are going to be working with. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to start by importing the user object. So I'm going to say from Django dot contrib dot auth dot models import user. Now you might be wondering why we're importing this user object, but I just want you to follow with me and I'll explain. We're importing this user object because, like I explained, we need to bind every to-do list that is created or every to-do list item that is created to a specific user. So it means that once I create a new to-do item, like I want to wash dishes, it has to be assigned to me because it's me who created it. So every to-do list item has to be assigned to a user. I'm going to create a new model and I'll call it class to do, right? And this is just going to inherit from models.model. Now, for those who don't fully understand, a model or models in Django are basically ways which help us represent, database schemas in a class. So, for example, now that I want to, be able to save to-do items, I've already explained the four fields which we have, which is the content, the user that created it, the date it was created, as well as the status, whether it is completed or not. Now, each of these fields are actually, or each of these data are actually represented as a table in a database. So it's represented in rows and columns, where each column represents each field. So a column can be like, the content. Another column can be the user who created it. Another column is the date it was created, and the last column is the status. While each row represents each entry in the database. So each row represents like a new entry. So when I create a new item in my to-do list, that is a new entry into the database under that specific table, which is called to do. So so models basically in Django help us represent these database. Sorry, it helps us represent this data that we're going to save in database as a class. And there's actually a lot of abstraction that has gone into this. We have something called the ORM in Django, which is the Object Relational Mapper, which helps us represent data in our database as classes. So instead of manually writing SQL code and SQL queries, we can make use of the model which has been given to us by Django to actually filter and get objects in database for specific tables like the to do. So that is like a brief explanation of what the model is. So the first field which we are going to create is the user. That is the user who created this to do item. And this is going to be a models.foreign key field. And I'm going to pass in user. Just follow with me. I'm going to explain what this means. And on delete is going to be models.cascade. Now, what exactly does this mean? We've created a new field or a new column in our database table called user, and we've assigned this to a models.foreign key. Now, what a foreign key does is that it ties this specific model. It creates a relationship between this specific model or the specific entry. It creates a relationship between that entry and another entry in the user object, in the user class, I mean. If I actually open it, you can see that this is the user model class, which has been created for us by default, which Django gives us. Now, what actually happens here is that we're telling Django, okay, we want to map this user object as a foreign key to we want to map this user field, I mean, as a foreign key to a field in the user class. So for example, now this user can be equated to a value like, let's just say 2. What that simply means is that the user who created this to do item in a database has an ID of 2 in the users table. So the users table can have, like different columns like first name, last name, username, ID, email, password. Now, one of the fields there or one of the columns there is ID. So what we're simply telling Django here is that we want to store the ID of the user who created this to-do item. That is why we're using a models of foreign key. It just maps this specific entry or it maps a specific to-do list item entry to the ID of a user who created the entry. Then what on delete? Or okay, before I go there, you see we're first of all passing in user because we're trying to reference this table. So foreign key is just a way that allows us link two tables together. Then we see on delete equals modules.cascade. What that simply means is that when that specific user with an ID of 2 gets deleted, what happens to all the to-do items which have been created by that user? On delete equals module.cascade simply means delete all the entries also which have been created by that user. So delete all the to-do list items which have been created by that user. So it creates like a cascading effect. That's why it's called modules or cascade. So because this user was deleted, now creates a cascading effect which allows all the to-do list items to get deleted also. So that is how that first line works. Then the next thing we're going to create is the content. That is the actual content, what the user wants to do. So this is just going to be a models, those character field or dot char field. Then the first thing we need to pass in here is the max length. Now, the character field just helps us store, like it helps us store string or, characters. A string is a sequence of characters. So it can help us store characters. It can help us store strings. Then what we need to specify is the maximum length. That is the maximum number of characters that this field can hold or this column can hold. So let's just say, for example, let's just put like 200. Then the next field we need to specify is whether is the field which tells us whether this to-do item has been completed or not. I'll create a new field and it to be is completed. Is completed. And this is going to be equated to a models.boolean field, um, a models.boolean field uh, and this is going to be equated to models.boolean field. Now, models.boolean field basically helps us store two values, either true or false. So what we're going to do is we're going to set the default to actually false. Because obviously, when you write a new item which you want to add to your to-do list, the moment you add it to your to-do list, it doesn't mean it's that very moment which you complete it. So that is why we're setting the is completed models of Boolean field to false as a default. Then the last thing we're going to specify is the date and time that this item was created. I'm just going to call it timestamp. That is the timestamp at which this to-do item was created. And this should be models.date time field. So this field is just going to help us store the date and time at which this item was created or this entry was created. And we can actually set something called auto now add equals true. So what auto now add equals true does is that the moment a new entry is created, it will automatically assign the current date and time at which the entry was created to this timestamp field. So we don't have to manually always set it by ourselves. By setting auto now add equals true, it will just check for the current date and time and it would automatically assign it to this timestamp. So all we are simply worried about when we are creating a new item is who is the user that's creating it and what is the content they're trying to create. By default, this would be set to false, and by default, which we have set, which we have specified, this would automatically be assigned. Now, one last thing that we're just going to do is, in order to view this model in our admin dashboard, we're just going to go to, in fact, before I show you how to do that, let's just make sure our server is running. Then I will go to the admin dashboard, which Django has given us. So once I go there, it's going to tell us to log in. So I'm just going to log in with my credentials. Now, once I do that, you can see that, we only have groups and users. But notice what happens the moment I register this model in our admin. So I'll go to my admin.py file. Let me just get rid of this. And I'm going to say from .models import to do. So what we're just simply saying is from this current folder, from the models file .models import to do, which is our model class. So what we're just going to say is admin.site.register. And in here, we're just going to pass in to do. So we're just telling Django, okay, I need you to add this to do item to the admin dashboard so that we can actually view it and work with the data. Let's make sure the server is running. Head to the browser and refresh. Now, once we do that, we can see that we now have our model here, which is called to-dos. Now, once I click it, You see it shows us an error saying no such table to do app underscore to do. Now we're getting this error because we haven't, made migrations and migrated. That is, we have created this class, but we haven't actually told Django to, create these tables in our database. We have only created a class which will help us, manipulate the data and relate the data in the database, but we haven't actually created that table in the database. So it's giving us that error. So what we're going to do is run Python manage.py, make migrations, just like that, then press enter. Then when you do that, you see it says migrations for to-do app and it says plus create model to do. What that basically means is that we are creating a new model called to do. Then we're just simply going to do Python manage.py migrate. So when we call migrate, we are basically taking all the changes we have made and we are applying it to the database. So that database table is going to be created. So once I clear my screen and run my server again, I will head to my browser and refresh. Now, once I refresh, you can see that the error is gone. And if I want to add a new to-do item manually, look at what it looks like. We have a user field, which shows us all the users that we have in our database. So if I go to users, you see that we have all of these users which we had created before when we were testing. And if I head back, you see that we have to select what user is creating this to-do list item. Then we have to type in the content. Then this is a checkbox which helps us dictate whether this to-do list item is completed or not. So let's just create a new like test to-do list item. Let me just say I want to wash dishes. And then obviously it won't be completed, yes, but let's just click save. Now, once I click save, you can see it says the to-do item was added successfully. Now, there's something I want to draw your attention to. You can see it is, when it's listing the actual to-do list item in this dashboard, it just says to-do object one. But we can actually create a string method which will help us render out the actual text. What that means is that head back to your modules.py file, and I want you to create a new string method. So you type def underscore underscore. This is short for dunder. So it's going to be def double underscore str double underscore, and this is going to take in self. So what we're just simply going to do is return self dot content. So instead of only just displaying, to do object one, what we're just going to do is, in order to return, some string that makes sense, to return something that we actually understand and not just the object ID, we are going to create a string method which will help us return the actual content and display it. So once my server has reloaded, I will head back and refresh. Now, once I refresh, you now see that the actual text is showing, I want to wash dishes. Now, we can actually edit this to make it even better. So I am just going to cut this and I can create like a formatted string. And just beside the formatted string, I can put self dot is completed. So basically, what I'm just trying to tell you is that for the string method, you can return whatever you want, even in a formatted string. So I can say completed, and then I'll put a colon there. And I can come here and say to do. And once I save that, I want you to notice how it looks like in dashboard. So I can come here and refresh, and you can see it says to do, I want to complete dishes. Then we have this pipe operator, I'm sorry, this pipe character, and completed is set to false. And if I click it, you can see it's the exact same details. And if I tick this is completed and save it, you now see that completed is set to true. So that's basically how you can, manipulate what gets displayed in the admin dashboard. So now you might think, but it is only an admin or a super user that has access to this dashboard. How do we now actually enable normal users create to do items in how do we allow normal users create to do items in our application? Now that is where we are going to start working with a different HTML file. So if I come to the resources place where I actually told you you would get all of those files, I am sure you have downloaded the index.html file. And if I open that index.html file right now, you are going to see exactly how it looks. So you can see that this is exactly how it looks. We have the user's name, we have a success message, we have a form where the user can actually type in whatever they want and they can click add task. We also have this logout button, then we have some text here for finished tasks, then we have 10 unfinished tasks, we have 4, then we have the actual tasks where once you click update, it will automatically mark it as completed, and you can also delete a specific task. So once you click update, it marks it as completed, or you can delete it. Then once you mark it as, once you mark it as finished, when you click update, it is going to put a strike or a dash right in the middle of the text. So it would signify that this task has been completed. So when you now also click update, it will then make this task uncompleted, or it will set is completed equals false. So this is exactly how the HTML form looks like, and this is exactly what we are going to be working with. I just wanted to show you how that file looks like. So that is the file which we are going to work with. I will just copy that file. I'm sure you already have it downloaded. But once you copy the file, head to your templates folder. And inside your templates folder, we're just going to create a new folder and we're going to call it home page. Now, once you create that folder, open it and paste the index.html file right in that folder. So right now, if we head back to our code editor or Visual Studio Code or whatever, we can go into templates and then we can see home page and see the index.html file which has been created for us. So what we're just simply going to do first of all is we are going to render out this HTML file using Django. So let's head to our views.py file inside the To-Do app. Now, once I open this, I'm just going to create a new view and I'll call it home_page, or we can just call it home, for example. Now, this is going to take in a request. And what we're just simply going to return is we're going to render out that home page, that index.html file inside the home page folder. I'm going to say return render, and this will first take in request. Then after taking in request, so this needs to have R beside it. So after taking a request, we then need to pass the file path to where index.html is. So because it is inside the home page, I'm going to type homepage/index.html. Now, once I save that, I will then head to my urls.py file, and I'm going to create my first urls.py. I'm going to create my first endpoint inside this urls.py file. So this is going to be path. And I'm going to leave this empty because I actually want this URL to be the base URL or the home page. Now, I know that we have a similar URL like that in authentication. So let me just open the authentication app. Where is it? And open my URL. So I'm just going to change this to /test home. So that would mean that this is no longer our home page, our base URL. This URL is then going to be our base URL. I'm going to call views.home and I'm going to give it a name of home, and then I'll put a comma here. So once I save this file and make sure my views is saved, once I reload, I can head to my browser. Sorry, not that. I can head to my browser and go to localhost port 8000. Now notice what we are going to see. Now once I load it, you can see that we have all of this text displayed, but obviously we see that it is the style isn't applied. That is because we haven't linked to the CSS file. So I'm just going to go to my HTML file, that is the index.html, and I will open it. Now you see that it is linking to a file called home_style.css. If we open the static folder, we can see that we already pasted that CSS file earlier in this video. So all we're just simply going to do is load or add this file or link this file using static. So first of all, I'm going to say load static. Remember, I had explained why we are doing this earlier. Then in here, I will copy the file path or cut it. Then I'm going to put my curly brackets and percentage signs. And I'm going to type static. And in single quotes, I will paste the actual link or the actual file path to where that style.css file is. Now, what I will just do is I will refresh the page. Now, once I refresh the page, you can now see that this is how it looks like. Now, the reason why all of the styles have not been applied, for example, this does not look like this, is because I actually need to connect to the internet. If I show you right here, we have also a style sheet which is linked to an online CSS file. So that is why all the styles are not showing. So I will just connect to the internet now so that this style sheet, which is online, can be loaded into our web page. So now I am connected to the internet. I will just head back to my browser and refresh. Now, once I refresh, you can see that the styles have been applied. So you can actually check this link out on your own. Now, once I click it, it will take me to the actual file, which contains all the CSS, as you can see. So this CSS is loaded from online into our HTML file. Now, after doing that, we can see now that our HTML file has been loaded properly. Now, let's just take a look at the structure and what we have. First of all, we see that we have the user's name being displayed. So John Doe, for example. Then we have a success message. Now, this text is only going to be displayed when we have, like a success message of to do added successfully or to do list item updated successfully. That is the only time when we're going to have this text being displayed. But I had just put it here as a placeholder so you can see. Then we have this form, which is called add task. We have this form with a button of add task. And the moment you fill this form and click add task, you are going to automatically add a new task to the database. So that is exactly what we are going to be working with first. And then once we've figured out how to actually add tasks to our database, we are then going to figure out how to display the tasks here and how to update, delete, how to display the number of finished and unfinished tasks, as well as how to log out. So we can actually just fix this logout button right now. We can actually make it work, right? As you can see, it worked. So let me head to my index.html file. If I look for the logout button, let me search it, logout. So you can see that the logout button already has a URL of logout, which I had already done. So once you are copying this file, you are going to notice that, or once you've copied this file, you are going to notice that this URL is actually already present in the href tag. So what we're just simply doing is we created a URL. So I could just actually do it again so I can explain to you. We created a URL here by putting in the quotes and percentage signs. And we just simply typed URL of logout. So what we're simply trying to do is we're trying to reference the logout URL, which is present in authentication right here. We referenced it using the name logout. So it redirected us to the logout endpoint, which then redirected us to the login page. So if I refresh now, I can then refresh and click logout. So once I click logout, you will notice that if I go to the home page, we are still able to access the home page. Now, the reason why we are able to access the home page is because we haven't told Django to only restrict this home page to only logged in users. What I'm going to do is I'm going to say from Django, I'm going to import the decorator, which helps us restrict specific views to only logged in users. So I'm going to say from Django.contrib.auth.decorators import login required. What we're simply doing here is we are trying to import the decorator, which will help prevent unauthenticated users from visiting an endpoint. So I'm going to put the @ symbol and put @ login required. So once I save it, we've now told Django to restrict that page to only logged in users. So once I save it and make sure my server is running, I will then head back and refresh. And once I refresh, you see we're being taken to the home page, to the login page, I mean. So I will just proceed to login right now. And once I press enter, you are going to see that we get taken to the home page, which is right here. Now, let us head to our URLs and just make sure that this has a name of home. And if we head to the authentication app, this also has a name of home. So you can see it can be confusing. So let's just change the name of this to test dash home so that we don't have any potential errors. So the home URL inside the authentication app has been changed to test dash home, while we now have the main home URL inside our to-do app. So I just wanted to change that so that we won't have any potential errors in future. So now if we check the logout, let me just minimize this. If we check the views.py file, in the logout view, you can see that we are redirecting the user to, after logging in, let's just check it. After logging in, you can see that we're redirecting the user to the home page. So that is when Django is going to come here, check a URL that has the name of home, and then redirects the user to this home view, which is right here. That is exactly what I wanted to explain. Now, the next step is we now need to make this form work. That is, we want a case where the moment a user fills this form and clicks add task, it will add a new entry to the database. So what we can actually do is we can create a new URL here, which will help us view the admin dashboard. I'm just going to head to the admin dashboard right here in this tab so that we can see it side by side. I'll go to to-dos. Now what we have here is basically just one simple to-do list item. And we are going to write some code which is going to enable us add to-do list items from this form. Now the first thing you will see here is John Doe, which is supposed to be the name of the user. Now because we are logged in as admin, I can just go to my index.html file, and where we have John Doe, we are going to replace it with the currently logged in user. So I'm going to say request.user, that is, we're grabbing the currently logged in user, does get full name. I believe that is a method which Django gives us by default, but let's just refresh. Now, something else that we'll have to make sure of is that the currently logged in user has a first name and a last name. As you can see, this admin user, which we created from the terminal, doesn't have a first name and a last name. So I will just put Jane Doe as the first and last names of this user. So once I do that, I am just going to scroll to the bottom and look for the save button. Now, once I save it, I'll head back and refresh. And what do you see? We see Jane Doe getting printed out to the front end because we had called request the user does get underscore full underscore name. Now, we didn't have to write any code for this get underscore full underscore name because Django already gives that to us by default. So what we're just going to do next is, like I said, make sure that this form works. Now, if you look at the form, you see that it has an empty action. So we can actually just clear that action. Now in HTML, action basically means what endpoint do you want to send all of this post data to, or what endpoint do you want to send all the data in this form to. Now if you leave it empty, it will just automatically send that post data to the current view which you are working with. But what we do need to give this form is a method. So we're going to set the method to be post because we're trying to send data to our view, and we're going to send this using a post request. Now remember, anytime you are working with HTML forms, you always have to put CSRF token. So CSRF, I can actually just type that here, CSRF underscore token. So we always have to have CSRF token when we are trying to send data to an endpoint. Now, if you look at this input field, you see it has a type of text which enables us enter text. Then you see it has a placeholder of add task. That is where you can now see this add task text being displayed. Then we now have something else called the name attribute. Now this name attribute has a name of add underscore task, but I will change it to task. So it means that when we send this data to our view, we are able to access that input field using the name attribute called task. And then you can see that it is required, meaning that we have to fill this form before we can submit it. Then if we look at the next input field, we actually see that it is a button. It is a button and it has a type of submit. So what we're simply telling HTML is that when this element is clicked, we simply want to submit the form. You can see that the value is called add task, which is why add task is written there. So it is basically a button which helps us submit this form. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to write some code in the views.py file, which will help us get this item which has been typed. So what I'm going to do first of all is I'm going to write an if condition to check if a post request is coming into. Let me just switch off my Wi-Fi to prevent my AI suggestions. So what we're going to do is we're going to write an if condition to check for incoming post request. I'm going to say if request on method is equals to post. That is, if the incoming method or if the incoming request has a method of post, which is what we have specified here. Let me just save it. We've given it a method of post. So we're checking if it is a post request. We just want to grab the task which has been sent by saying task is equals to request does post does get, and in here we're passing in task. So the reason why we're passing in task is because we have given it a name of task. So this will enable us grab whatever has been imputed. Now, after grabbing what has been imputed, what we then need to do is we then need to, get the currently logged in user. Now, when we want to get the currently logged in user, all we are simply saying is, all we're simply going to do is tell Django to grab the currently logged in user. So we're going to say user is equals to request.user. So when we call request.user, Django is going to return to us the user object of the currently logged in user. So we can then save that in a variable. Now, after calling that user object, the next thing we now obviously need to do is save that to do or that new task item to the database. So what we need to do is we need to import this module into our views.py file. So I'm going to say, let me create space here. I'm going to say from .models import to do. Import to do. So this will import the to do class in our models into our views.py file. So at this point, we're going to create a new task or a new to do item. Let me just document it, to do item. Now we're going to create a new variable and call it new to do or new task rather. And we're going to equate this to our to do class, which we have just created. So new task is equals to do, which is the model which we created earlier. Now, what exactly are we going to pass into this to do class? The only things that we actually need to pass in is the user who is creating this to do item and the actual content, that is the text which they had typed into this form. Now, we've already said that by default, this is completed is going to be false, and then the timestamp is going to be, automatically added. So what we're just going to do is we're just going to only pass in the currently logged in user and the content. So I'm going to say user is equals to user. That is, we're trying to say set the user of this new to do item to the currently logged in user. And then the next thing is we're going to say content is equals to task. So we're setting the content of this new to do item to be the task which has been entered. And all we simply need to do is say new task.save. Now, once we've saved this new task, we then need to create a new message. That is, we need to create a new message so we can display to the user, letting them know that that their task has been created successfully. What I would just simply do is here, I'm going to say from Django.contrib import messages. And then I am also going to import redirect right here. Now, after saving that object, I am going to create a new message I'm going to create a new message by saying messages.success. And this is going to take in request. And it's going to have a text of new to do or new task saved successfully with an exclamation mark. Then all we're just simply going to do is after creating this message, we're going to redirect the user back to the home page so that that message can be rendered out here. So I'm going to say return redirect. And where are we redirecting to? We're redirecting to the home page. And the home page is, obviously this URL which has the name of home. So it's now going to redirect the user back to this view. And since it isn't a post request but a get request because we're trying to load this view, it will skip this if request or method is equal to post and to return this HTML file. So let's save that. Then we now need to head to the index.html file. And remember what we did for the login.html file. We need to write some code which will actually help us render out, which will actually help us render out the message. So instead of writing it from scratch, I will actually just go to the authentication page, go to login, and actually copy it. Now, once I copy it, I will head back to the index.html, and right below the h5 tag, I will paste it. So all we just need to do is indent this properly. So let me indent this properly. Okay. Now, we need to change the text for the success message. So I will copy what we have here, which is default text. I will actually cut it instead of copy it. And I will replace this success message, this one here, with that. And in here, instead of this default text of success message, I will just render out message. So if it is a success message, it is going to render out a H5 tag, which has a style color of slate blue. So let me also change this from H4 to H5 in case there is an error, so that the size of the text is consistent. So now, once I have saved this, it means we are now able to render out any messages if any have been created. So let's head to the HTML file, refresh. Now, once we refresh, you can see that that text is gone. I'm just going to add a new task called wash dishes. And I'm going to click add task. Now, once I click add task, you can see it says new task saved successfully. So you can see that it is being displayed in the center, but we want it to just be displayed right here towards the left. So I am going to remove this center tag right here. I'll remove it there. I'm going to remove it here also. Let me just remove this here. I'm going to save it. But the main idea is that you can now see that it is new task successfully saved. And if I go to the dashboard and I go to to-dos, you are going to see that we now have a new item called wash dishes. This is one which we are just created. And if I click it, you can see that the user was set, the text was set, and then the is completed was not set by default. It was set by to false, I mean by default. So you can see that we are able to actually create new items. Let me just create a few more, like read a book, and I'm going to click add task. Now you can see the success message is being saved here. And the last one we're going to put is, let's just say, take a walk in the evening. And once I click add task, again, we're going to see this success message. And if I head to my dashboard and refresh, we can see that all our to-do list items are being saved in the dashboard. So this is perfect because we are now able to enable any user log into our website and actually create a new to-do list item, and we can see that it gets saved. Now you might ask yourself, okay, now that we have saved these to-do list items, how can we now display them in the home page? That is, all of these are just displayed by default. If I actually go to the HTML file, you can see that this is being displayed by default. Finished tasks of 10, unfinished tasks of 4. That is what we have here. And we also have by default all of these tasks which have been created. What we actually then need to do is that we need to write some code which will help us retrieve all the tasks which have been created by the currently logged in user, and some extra code which will help us display all the tasks, as well as extra code which will help us count the number of finished and unfinished tasks. So let's do that. The first thing that we're going to do is write some code which will help us gather all the tasks which have been created by this specific user. So I am going to come down and I'll create a new variable and I'll call it user tasks. That is, these are all the tasks which the user has been able to create in our app or in our Django application. So how do we actually go through the database to check for all the tasks which has been created by one user? We see that every task or every to-do item has a user assigned to it. So what we can do is we can filter through the database to grab all the tasks which have been created by one specific user, which is the currently logged in user. That is why we had used a foreign key, and you can see that it is important now because every user needs to have a way of linking to their own task which was created. So I'm just going to say to do, which is our model class, dot object obj ects dot filter. Now Django gives this to us by default. If we actually wanted to do this using if we actually wanted to do this using SQL, it would look something like this. So let me just, if we wanted to write it using SQL, it should look something like this. Select star from, let's just say to do, where user equals, like 1. So this is what the SQL query would look like if we were to start writing SQL queries manually by ourselves. But what Django just helps us to do is it helps us, it helps us interact with the database using classes, right? Where each entry in database is, each row or each entry in database can be represented as an object of our model class. So this is what we would actually have to do if we wanted to grab all of these. We'll just select star from to do, which is our database table, where the user ID is equals 1. So we would have to do something like this. But Django already has given us, a way of interacting with the database using how we are familiar with working with Python, which is classes and objects. We're going to say to do the objects of filter. And what do we want to do? We want to grab every single to do item created by the currently logged in user. I'm just going to say user is equals to request dot user. Instead of actually typing request dot user twice, if you look at it, we have request dot user written here. What we can actually do is we can move this line of code outside this if condition and place it at the top. So that would mean we no longer have to specify request dot user again. We just say user is equals to user. So what that means now is that we're telling Django, search the database and filter for all the to-do list items whose user was created by this user. And this user is the currently logged in user. So that is what we are simply going to do. Then after doing all of this, let's just actually just print out, first of all, let's just print out user tasks to see what we have. So once I save it, I'll check if my server is running. I'll head to the web page and let me just refresh. Now, once I refresh, if you go to the terminal, you can see we have a list, right? We have a query set, and this query set is a list of objects which have been created for us. So each of these objects represents an entry. Each of these objects are a to-do object, as you can see, to do. And each of these objects represents an entry in the database. So you can see we have a bunch of these to-do items being printed. So it means that this user has to-do items. So what I can then do is create a dictionary, and this is going to be a context dictionary. Now, if you're not familiar with this, a context dictionary basically helps us to return data to the HTML form. So if we want to render out some data in the HTML file and we want to get that data from our Python view or our views.py, we can put it in a context, and then in the render method, we can pass in that data, and then we are able to work with data in the HTML file. So we are going to see how it will work. So I'm just going to call these tasks, and I'm going to equate this to user tasks. Now let's now put a comma here, and inside this render, I will come and pass in context. Now it is also important to note that you could just directly take this dictionary, right? And where you have context, you could just paste it there, and this is actually totally fine. But because in future we're actually going to be passing in more than one item, it's just better to create the dictionary separately so that the readability is better, it's improved instead of squeezing everything inside here. So I'm just going to save it. Now once I save it and I refresh, Obviously, nothing is going to happen because all we're simply doing is we are sending that data to the HTML file, but we are not working with that data. What I am going to do is we are going to look at the structure of each to-do item. We can see that each item is inside a div called item-row. So what we can do is we can write a for loop, which would actually loop through all of the tasks which have been sent. That is, all of the tasks which have been sent, we can write a for loop to render out everything, and you're going to see how it works. So I'm going to put my curly bracket and say for task in tasks. So we're saying for task in task because we are trying to loop through all the tasks which we've passed into this dictionary, and all those tasks are coming from this filter object. So that is why we are saying for task in tasks. So I'm just going to put an N for here. Now the reason why we are putting an N for right there is because we are just going to generate this HTML. Now there's something called generating HTML, right? Where for every single task, we are going to put in the data into this HTML. And what the HTML will actually do is it would now, what Django will actually do, and the Django templating language, what it will do is it will create multiple copies of this div, but each of those copies are going to contain different data, which we are going to pass in automatically. Now, let's just see how we're going to do that. Now, we see that each of these items are different. There's a text here, read a book, watch a YouTube video, wash dishes. Now, what we're just simply going to do is, instead of read a book, we're just going to put task.content. Now, the reason why we're putting task.content is because, remember, we're looping through all the tasks which have been sent in this context. And each task is an object of the to-do class. And the to-do class has a field called content, which actually helps us store the actual text or the actual content. That is why we are saying task.content, right? Now, once I save that, before we refresh, there's actually something else that we have to do. We need to write an if condition inside here. Now, if you go to the front end, we see that completed tasks have a strike through between them or in the middle to indicate that the task has been completed. What we need to do is, before actually rendering out this task, we need to check if that task has been completed or not. And if we scroll down, we can see that the one which has been completed, the last one, it has a this HTML element called strike, which helps to strike, puts that dash between the text. What we're just going to do is we're going to write an if condition to check if the current task is completed. And if we go to the models, we can see that we have a field called is completed. So I'm just going to write an if condition right here. I'm going to say if task dot is underscore completed, then I'm going to put an end if right here. Remember, you always have to close your your template blocks, like your Ginger templates code. Now we're saying if task dot is completed, that is, this would either return true or false. So we're simply saying if true or if false. Then if true, we are going to just put we're going to, before we actually display the task, we are going to create a strike tag right here. Let me just create and close the strike tag. That is, if it is completed, then we want to display it with a strike going through it. So it would mean that that task is complete. Then we're going to write an else block. That is, else, if it isn't completed, we're just going to come down here and display or render out the task. So what that now means is that we can get rid of these extra two dummy data which has been there. So I can actually save that now, head to my browser and refresh. Now notice what we have. Once I refresh, you see we have an error saying invalid blog tag on line 43 else. So right here, okay, this is supposed to be ELSE, not ESLE. So ELLSE. So that is else. So once I save that and refresh, you can now see that we have all of these, tasks being displayed. We have I want to wash dishes because it is striked out because it is completed. Now, if I go to my dashboard, you can see that I want to wash dishes is actually true. Completed is true. So we can see that It has been striked out. Then we have wash dishes, read a book, take a walk in the evening. If we head to the dashboard, we see those exact same things. Take a walk in the evening, read a book, wash dishes. Now, there's something I want you to take note of. The oldest task is what is being displayed first. But what we want is that we want the newest tasks to always be displayed on top. Because obviously the new ones should be displayed on top, not the old ones being displayed on top. So there is something that Django gives us called order by, and we can actually order by the time at which the task was created. Now that is important. That is why we have this field called timestamp. So we can actually go to our query right here. So what we have here is a query set. It is a query because we're writing a query or we're creating a query which will be executed on the database. Even though we've written it in an object, using object, it's actually converted into an SQL query and data is retrieved. So you can actually put dot order by. You can see it already even suggests it. Now, when you put dot order by, what you need to put in is what do you actually want to order this query set by? Now, because we want to order by timestamp, that is the newest to oldest, we are then going to put in quotes timestamp, but we need to put a dash there. So when we put dash timestamp, we're telling Django that we want to go from the newest to the oldest first. So once we do that, make sure our server is running, right? Let me just scroll to the bottom. We can now go to our browser and notice that this take a walk in the evening will become first. Let me refresh. You can now see that take a walk in the evening is first and I want to wash dishes is last. Now this is because we have already told Django to, first of all, filter the database and grab all the tasks created by this specific user. Then we're telling it to order the tasks by dash timestamp, which tells it the newest entry to the oldest entry based on timestamp. We could actually also do this by ID. We could also say dash ID because we didn't specify the ID actually of each field. That is, for example, I didn't specifically come here and say ID is equals to models.integer field, right? Django already actually assigns this by default to every single model that we create. So that is why I didn't have to specify it. So when I say dash ID, Django is also going to filter by ID from the newest to the oldest. So once I refresh, you can see that it is the exact same thing from newest to the oldest. But I am just going to use timestamp because I prefer using timestamps actually, which will filter based on, which one is the newest and which one is the oldest. So once I save that, you can see that it works. Now we need to do three more things actually. We need to make sure that this update works. That is, we need to enable users update a task and set it as completed. We also need a user to be able to delete a task. Then we also need to display the number of finished tasks and unfinished tasks. Now, Django actually makes this easy for us. Now, in order to display the finished tasks, I will just create a new entry in my tasks. I'll just create a new entry in my context and I'll call it finished tasks. And I'm going to equate this to 0 for now. And I will also do the same for unfinished tasks. And I'll equate this to 0 for now. Now, how exactly do we count the number of finished and unfinished tasks? Django gives us a model, or Django gives us a method that we can apply on models called dot count. And what dot count actually does is that it helps us to count the number of items in a certain, the number of items in a certain, for example, like filter. To help us to count the number of items which are present or the number of objects. But before we count, we need to get the number of tasks which have been finished. So what we can do is create a new variable, and I'll call it finished tasks. And I'll equate this to user tasks, right, dot filter. So what does this dot filter mean? What it simply means is that we have created a query set here, right? So what this returns, as you saw before, is a list of query sets. So it's a query set rather, which is a list of to-do items. Now we've performed filter on this object and we order this by timestamp. Now what we can also do is we can also filter this query set which has already been performed. So Django allows us filter objects which have already been filtered. So it's just, obviously because it is, object-oriented programming, we're allowed to do this. So we're allowed to call methods on objects. So this actually returns an object, a to-do list, a to-do object. So because it's an object, we're allowed to call the filter method on it again. So what do we want to filter by? We want to grab all the user tasks which have been completed. Is completed is equals true. So that is what I'm going to pass in here. Is completed is equals true. And I will do the exact same thing for unfinished tasks. So I'm going to call this unfinished tasks, and is completed is going to be false. So once I do that, instead of putting this as 0, I will just equate this to finished tasks and equate this to unfinished tasks. So this way, we're able to count the number of tasks which have been finished and the number of tasks which are unfinished. Now that we've passed this into the context, all we need to do is go to the HTML file, and where you see finished task, instead of putting 10, we're just going to put the data which has been returned. And here I'm going to remove 4, and I'm going to pass in unfinished tasks here. Now, once I save, head back to my browser. Notice that we have 1, 2, 3, 4 tasks. Out of these 4, 1 is completed, but 3 are uncompleted. So that is what we should see here. Now, once I refresh, okay, you see that we have this query set being returned back to us. Now, the reason why we have this query set being returned back to us is because I had forgotten to call the dot count method. So all we're just simply going to do is call dot count. And I'm going to call dot count, the one which I had explained earlier. So let me just explain this again. We have filtered the database right here to get all the tasks which have been created by the currently logged in user, and we have ordered it by the timestamp. So this is also going to return a list of, a query set which contains a list of to-do items, which is what we have here. Now, all we're simply doing is for the finished tasks, we're now taking this object which contains all the tasks created by the user, and because it is an object, and it's because it's an object of the to-do class, and the to-do class is an object, the to-do class inherits from models.model. We are now able to call this filter method again. So we're trying to filter by the number of completed tasks, setting it to true, and then we're calling dot count. Dot count is also an inbuilt method which has been given to us that we can use to count the number of tasks or count the number of objects which exist in a certain query set, like filter. I'm just going to save that after calling it dot count. So we're doing the exact same thing for unfinished tasks. Once my server is running, I will head to my browser and refresh. Now, once I refresh, you can see that we now have finished task is 1, unfinished task is 3. So Django now is able to properly return to us the number of finished and unfinished tasks. So we've been able to accomplish one thing. Now, the next thing which we need to accomplish is to actually now enable the user be able to update a task to mark it as completed, or either update it to mark it as uncompleted, or we then need to, and the second task is we can enable the user delete, we can enable the user delete a task. So deleting the task will actually be, the easier and shorter thing to do first. So what I will do is I will head to the views.py file, and we are going to create a new view which will help us delete tasks. So I am going to create this view, and I'll call it dev delete task. Now, a user has to be logged in before they can actually um, access this view. So let's call at login required. So this will take in request, and then after taking in request, it's going to take in something called task ID. Now you are going to see how this will work. This task ID is going to be a URL parameter. So when we are trying to visit that endpoint to delete a task, we are going to need to pass in the ID of the task which we are trying to delete, because obviously we can't just delete a task without knowing its ID or without knowing a way of identifying that specific task. And an ID is a way of identifying tasks. It's very easy. So that is why we're taking in task ID as a URL parameter. Now, once we do that, The first thing that we're going to do is grab the to do object which has that specific and which has an ID which was passed into the URL. So we are going to use try and except blocks for this. Let me just put dot there, and then except I'm going to put dot here. So let's explain what we're going to do here. We're going to try and get a task whose ID matches what was passed into the URL. Now that is why we're using try and except blocks. We're going to try to get it. But if no task with that ID exists in the database, Django is going to give us an error. It's going to generate an error for us of saying it's going to generate an error, and that error is going to be no object of this class to do exists in the database. So that is why we are putting an except block to actually catch that error. So we're going to say try task is equals to do dot object dot get. So we're calling the dot get method, right? And this is actually going to be an SQL query, which is going to help us go to the database and get a task whose ID is this. So I'm just going to say ID is equals to task ID. Now remember, I mentioned that when we were creating the model, we didn't have to pass in ID as a field. Django just automatically generates that for us. So in a case where we've been able to get the task ID, all we're just simply going to say is task.delete. Now the delete is a method that Django gives us by default, which we're able to call on objects. So after getting the task object here or the to-do object here, we're just going to call .delete, which is going to delete it from the database. Now after deleting it, we want to create a new success message by saying messages.success, and then we're going to pass in request. After passing in request, we're going to say task deleted successfully. Now, after deleting that task successfully, we're then going to redirect the user to the home page so that we're going to see that message, and we'll also notice that the task has been removed. So we're going to say return and redirect. And where do we want to redirect to? We want to redirect the user to the home page. So I'm just going to pass in home here. Now, if for any reason that task with an ID of what was passed into the URL does not exist, it's going to generate an error. And the error that is going to generate is the object, the class which that object belongs to, does not exist. So I'm going to put to do dot does not exist. So you're going to see exactly what this means. So we are going to try to guess that object first of all, an object that has an ID of task ID which was passed into the URL. But if, for example, in our HTML form, in our HTML file, we're now passing a wrong task ID, that is, if the wrong ID is now put in this delete link, Django is now going to generate a new error saying to do does not exist. That is, the to do class does not have any object whose ID is this task ID which we've passed in here. So that is why I said to do does not exist, meaning that, okay, the to do class does not have any object whose ID is the ID which was passed in here. So at this point, we're just going to create a new error message by saying messages.error, and then we're going to pass in request, and we're going to say no task with that ID exists in the database, and then I'm going to return the user also to the home page once again so that they can actually view that error. So once I save it, the next thing I need to do is map this view to a URL. So I will copy it, go to my urls.py file, and in here I'm going to put path, and this is going to be delete dash task /. Now notice something. We are passing in the ID as a URL parameter, and we are getting that ID in our view function by passing it in. Now, in order to pass that ID in, we will need to actually create a way to be able to pass that parameter into the URL so that it will then be passed to the view. So what we can do is, if you look at the view, it has a parameter called task_ID. So in order to pass that in, we're going to put the square bracket here. I'm going to type int : task underscore ID, and we're going to put our curly bracket here. So I'm going to explain what this is, but let's just follow with me. So I'm going to say views does delete task, and I'll give it a name of delete underscore task. Now let's look at what we have here, right? So we put delete task forward slash, then we have this angle bracket, and we have int colon task ID. So what we're telling Django here is that we are expecting a URL parameter and it is of the type int, so it is an integer. Because we're trying to pass in the task ID, we have to make sure that it is an int. And what we're now saying is that this parameter has a name or a value or a placeholder of task underscore ID. Now that is how we are able to take in task underscore ID in our view. So if this was task underscore ID underscore value, for example, we would also need to come to the URL and type value here. So we would leave it like this. But since we already set this to task underscore ID, we're just going to leave it that way, right? So I just want you to save your URL, make sure it's saved. Now, the next thing which we are going to do is we are going to then copy the name, which is delete underscore task, and we're going to head to our index.html. Now, if you remember, each of these items have a button of delete, and we want a case where when we press delete, they get redirected to this view. The view gets the ID and deletes it. So what we're just simply going to do is here where we have delete, we're going to create, our curly brackets as well as percentage signs. And we're going to type URL. And inside the URL, we're just going to put delete task. So we're trying to link to this delete task. Now remember that this URL has a parameter of task underscore ID. We then need to pass this parameter in. And to pass this parameter, we're just going to put a space immediately after the URL name. And we're going to type the parameter, which is going to be task.id. So that is exactly what we are going to need to do. Just put URL keyword, then we put the URL name, which was delete underscore task, and then we pass in the parameter, which is task.id. So now once I head to the web page and I refresh, once it refreshes, if I hover over this, towards the bottom left of my screen, you can see it says localhost port 8000 forward slash delete dash task forward slash 4. So what that means is that we were successfully able to pass in the task ID. Now let's delete it and see what happens. I'm just going to press delete. Now once I delete it, you can see that we now only have 3 tasks which are being displayed, and then we have a success message saying task deleted successfully. I can actually then go to the dashboard, refresh, and see that we have only 3 tasks which are displayed here. So that is how we can make this task work, this task deletion work. I could even delete this other one, and you can see that our delete works perfectly. Now, the next thing that we need to do is the update feature. We want a case where once you click update, it will either set the task to be completed or not. So if the task is already completed like this, it will then set completed to false, meaning that you want to unmark it as completed. But if it isn't completed, when you click update, it will set the task as complete. So let's see how that will work. I want you to head to your views, and we're actually going to copy this delete view, but we're going to be making a few changes. The first thing that we're going to change is the view name. So we're going to call it update task status. And this is also going to take in task ID. So what we're going to do is we're also going to leave this try and except blocks. So what that would mean is that if, for example, a user tries to update a task whose ID doesn't exist, if, for example, we mistakenly passed in the wrong task ID here, it's going to generate an error. So we're going to leave this try and except blocks. But instead of deleting, we are going to write an if condition here. We are going to check if the task is already completed, and we're going to set is completed to false. But if the task is not completed, then we're going to set completed to true. So let's see how we do that. We're going to say if task dot is completed, right? Then we're going to put a colon. Then we're going to set the task completion status to false. We're going to say task dot is completed is equals to false. Then we're not going to write an else here. That is else meaning that if the task is not completed, then I'm just going to copy this line and I'm going to set the false to true. And at the end of it all, I'm just going to call task.save. Because at this point, we have only changed the current object, that is the instance of this to-do class. We have changed the object field of is completed to false or true. We now actually need to call .save so that the current instance of the object gets saved to the database. Then after it gets saved, we're just going to say task updated successfully. Let's go over it again. We are specifying that this view needs to require, we're specifying that a user needs to be logged in to access this view by saying at login required. Let me just make sure. Okay, at login required. Then the next thing that we've done is we've created a view called update task status, takes in request and takes in task ID. We're now going to try to get the task. If the task is completed, we're going to set the completion status to false. But if the task isn't completed, we're going to set the completion status to true. And then we're going to save it and return the result to the home page and display a success message. So I'm just going to come and create a URL. So let me just copy this line. But instead of delete task, this should be update dash task dash status. And this will be, instead of use or delete, it will be update task status. So I have given this URL a name of update task status. Now it is important to note that the name of the URL doesn't have to match the view name. You can put in whatever you want here. But I just think this name is very descriptive and I just left it like that. So for your case, you can choose to either leave it and follow the same thing I did, or you can choose to use a different name. So I'm going to copy the name of this URL, head to my index, and right here where we have this updates, we're going to put the curly bracket, the exact same thing, put URL, and we're going to put in the name of that URL, which is update task status. And then all we're simply going to pass in is task.id. And once we pass task.id in, it would mean that users would then be able to complete, the task. So after saving that, I can actually head to my views right now to test this. So I'm just going to refresh. So let's say I update this read a book. Once I click update, you can see that it says task updated successfully. And you can see there is a strike there, signifying that this is actually completed. But let's say I click update on this, I want to wash dishes. Once I click it, you can see that I want to wash dishes has now been on, the strike has been removed because it is no longer completed. So I can actually just come here to, add a few more tasks like take a walk in the evening. Let's say watch a movie, and I can click add task. Now, once I do that, I can set I want to wash dishes to complete. We can see finished task is 2, unfinished task is 2. I can also update watch a movie, finished tasks 3, unfinished tasks 1. So you can see now that everything is working, perfectly. We're able to, create to do items. We're able to, enable the user login and, register, login, create items, update, delete. I could even delete this, take a walk in the evening, and we can see that all our tasks are completed. Now, what I can do is we can even start this process again, but using a different user account. So let me just delete this test user account actually. So I will just come here and delete it. So once I delete it, we are then going to create a new user, log in with that user and create new tasks. So I'm going to click logout and then I'll click sign up. So once I click sign up, I'm going to put the first name as, let's just say John, and the last name is going to be Doe. The username is going to be test user. Email is going to be this. Password is going to be password there, and then password there. So I will then click register. So we're just going to test out all the features which we have written so far. So you can see that it now says account created successfully, right? To log in. So I'm just going to log in with those credentials. So I'm going to say test user, and then I'm going to enter the password. So once I enter the password, you can now see that we are being brought to the home page and all the tasks are empty. Now the task, you can't see any task because this user hasn't created any task at all the tasks which have been created in a database actually belong to the admin users. That is why we can't see any task being created. And all that is made possible through this line right here in our home page where it says to do the objects of filter. So search database and grab tasks which have been created by the currently logged in user. So what we can now simply do is head to, we can head to this page and actually proceed to create extra tasks. So I'm just going to create extra tasks right now. And the first one is going to be make a new YouTube video. And I'm going to save that. The next one is going to be, for example, edit video. I can add one more. And the last one could be like have lunch because it's 12 p.m. So once I click enter, you can now see that we have unfinished tasks of 3 and all these are uncompleted. So what I can do is I can even open a new incognito tab so that I can log in as an admin. So you can see that these tasks are actually different. So I can go to localhost port 8000 and I'll be redirected to the login page. So I'll put in my username there, I'll put in my password there. And once I log in, now, it isn't loading because I'm not connected to the internet, but you can see that this user is Jendo. Jendo. What I mean is you can't see the style because I'm no longer connected to the internet. This user right here that is logged in is Jendo, and this user is John Doe. And you can see that this user has 3 completed tasks, finished tasks of 3, unfinished tasks of 0. So you can see basically now that we are able to, I can even log out. You can see basically that we are able to have multiple users on this simple to-do list websites which we have created. So users can add tasks, log out. I can come here and update this task or make new YouTube video, and you can see that it has been updated. So that is basically all the code that we are going to write to build this very simple to-do list website. So if you have any question concerning all what we've done so far, please feel free to drop a comment in the comment section and I will definitely reply you. Now, the next step that we are going to take is I'm actually going to teach you how to, deploy this Django project. Now, because I already have a tutorial that teaches how to deploy Django project for free to render, you can even, get a free Postgres database that you can connect to your project. I'm just going to redirect you to that video because this video is actually very long. I'm sure you can see the duration right now. So I'm going to redirect you to that other video. And once you watch that, you are going to get all the knowledge and all the understanding you need to actually deploy your Django projects to, to render. So what that would mean is that you will have a live link which you can send to anybody in the world, and they will be able to register on your website, test your to-do list and make use of it. So right here is the video which I made. You can see it's 30 minutes long. So it basically teaches you how to deploy your Django project to Render. Now, Render is a platform where you can deploy, your Python web apps too for free. You can deploy it for free. You can have a Postgres database there for free. So I had uploaded this video a year ago, which details and explains exactly how to deploy your Django project. Now, there's going to be a link to this video in the description of of this tutorial. Just check the description. You are going to see a link which will take you to this video where it teaches you exactly how to deploy your project to render. So you can see it's here. You can see there's a lot of comments that say thanks a lot. So it's a lot of people basically saying it worked. So it's a very good platform to deploy your Django projects for free, and you can have it live. So that is all we're going to talk about in this video. If you have any question, don't forget to ask it in the comment section. And also, if you want to get all the code to this project, there's going to be a link in the description which will also take you to a GitHub repository where you can, get all the code, and where you can get all the code that we have written so far. And also, remember that I had mentioned that we had some resource files at the beginning, these HTML files as well as the CSS. I just wanted to remind you once again that there's going to be a link in the description which will take you to where you can download those files from. So thank you for watching this tutorial, and if you have any question, don't hesitate to leave it in the comment section and I'll reply you. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.